protect sacred and sovereign spaces from occupation. That demand continues today, despite India's ongoing repression of Sikh dissent, including the targeting of Sikh activists beyond India's borders through extrajudicial killings and transnational repression. Baku Initiative Group stands as a result-oriented platform, contributing to the delivery of the voices of Sikh communities to the international community.
Very much would like to thank the Baku Initiative Group for putting that video together. It gives you a glimpse into some of the violence that occurred in 1984. I'd like to point out, just before we start here, that when you see these videos, it's actual footage of what you're seeing of real people, real lives. And we talk about the loss of life. Sometimes we limit it to just the actual physical bodies that were lost. Under colonial structures, under colonial powers, one of the primary ways of making people actually forget who they are is erasure. And that erasure is not only physically, it's actually done through the burning of literature. Our Sikh reference library was burned after the attack on the Golden Temple, Darbar Sahib, in June of 1984. And that reference library contained over 1,500 ancient manuscripts, 20,000 ancient books, things that connected us to our culture, our language, our heritage and our faith. Those were robbed by the Indian Army and never returned to us. This is a fundamental way of how many colonial powers have actually acted and behaved in ancient times as well. And you can go back almost 500 to 600 years through the conquests of South America and North America, where literature was burned in mass numbers by those that were colonizing those continents at the time. So this idea of making people forget assimilation and erasure is not a new idea. People around the world that have been subjugated to that colonization know this very well. And I'm sure many of you in this room have heard stories and have been accustomed to these types of things happening, unfortunately, on this land as well. We're going to move into our first panel, which is going to be 1984 in a historical and genocidal context. This will actually cover off many pieces of this genocide. It'll give you some facts and figures, ideas, but it actually will talk more about where this all started from in our first panelist discussion with us. He will be speaking to the historical trajectories of state violence leading to June 1984. So to understand June 1984, we need to understand where in the historical trajectory from British occupation until 1984, how that happened. And he will be giving you some overview of that. I would like to just point out one thing here as we kind of move into the first presentation, that this type of historical trajectory, like I was saying, is not new. I want to give you one example from the land that we come from currently, which is North America, Canada, and some here from the United States. In the 1870s, there was a captain in the United States Army named Richard Pratt. This individual is credited with developing what is called the residential school system. The residential schools where you had the Aboriginal and Indigenous people of that land who were actually living there for thousands of years. These schools were made to go to their villages, to take their children at the age of 5 years old, snatch them out of their homes, bring them to these residential schools. And Captain Richard Pratt had coined a phrase called "kill the Indian, save the man." They used to refer to these individuals as Indian. Kill the Indian, save the man meant destroy their heritage, their culture, their way of life, and their language, and leave the man that can be Christianized. These were Christian schools that were made to take Aboriginal children for up to 15 years away from their families. From the age of 5 to the age of 18 to 20, children were not allowed to return home, and their parents were not allowed to see them. These children's, their entire dress code, they weren't allowed to speak their language, they had long hair, their hair was cut, they were completely turned into a colored version of a European Christian, and then they were, basically their entire history and lineage was erased in that way. So when we look at ourselves right now in Punjab, we often see very much similarities between what happened then and what's happening now. And this is what erasure actually does. It makes you forget who you are, and if you forget who you are, you lose the ability to struggle and to actually be a revolutionary, to bring change into the world. You become accustomed to the status quo. So our first presenter here will be Prabjot Singh. He's the legal advisor to the Sikh Federation of Canada. He's a lawyer by background, and he will be speaking to the historical trajectories of state violence leading to the June 1984 genocide. So I'll turn it over to Prabjot Singh, and my ask is for the panelists to speak from the table that's set out in front of them, and the podium will just be used for introductions, but I'll turn it over to Prabjot Singh. Thank you.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. First of all, I want to thank the Baku Initiative Group for hosting and facilitating today's conference, and to all the students and professors who are joining us here today for this conversation. And as my colleague Maninder Singh had mentioned, what's important here is understanding that the events of June and November 1984 were not singular moments in history. They weren't isolated, they didn't happen all of a sudden and then end. They weren't temporary failures of law and order, and they weren't the product of one government, one party, or one prime minister. June and November 1984 are the violent culmination of a much longer history and a trajectory that starts with and continues with colonial occupation, state centralization, forced assimilation, and the systematic repression of Sikh sovereignty. So in order to understand 1984 in its entire holistic context, we have to go back 135 years prior to 1849. 1849 marks the formal colonization of the Sikh homeland of Punjab by the British colonial state. It marked the destruction of the Sikh Raj, the sovereign Sikh rule that was governing Punjab at the time, and the incorporation of Punjab into an imperial order that understood Sikh sovereignty as a threat that needed to be dismantled in every form. So this context is relevant and it's important because when we frame and understand the trajectory of the violence better, we understand where it came from and where it's going to better understand what it looks like and how it operates today. And the main thing that we have to understand and get across today is that occupation and genocide are not singular events. They're structures. Occupation doesn't simply end when an army or a political force leaves a battlefield or a territory. It continues to survive through institutions, laws that are imposed on people, court systems, police, bureaucracy, borders, and knowledge systems that are used to discipline a people into subjugation when they're imposed by a foreign power to disfigure and disorient a people from understanding and connecting with who they are at their core. So occupation survives by reshaping how people understand themselves, how they're governed, and how their resistance is criminalized. So when the British colonized Punjab, they didn't just take territory, they tried to reorganize the very core of Sikh life. And they did this through a number of mechanisms. The first is the most obvious, the most apparent that we see and speak about is genocide. Sikhs in the mid-1800s who resisted and defied colonial authority were marked as enemies and were killed, imprisoned, exiled, and criminalized. Beyond that, though, the colonial state understood that power doesn't only operate through that kind of military force. It operates through knowledge systems as well. So Sikh texts, books, and knowledge systems were burnt and destroyed and dismantled in mass because they carried the memory, the culture, the values, and alternative ways of organizing political life based on Sarbat da Pala, the welfare of all, and justice that's rooted in Sikh spirituality. So to attack Sikh knowledge systems was to attack the ability of the Sikh people to narrate our own history and define our future on our own terms. So after that, the colonial state then continues to ramp up this entire mechanism and this structure of occupation. When they banned traditional arms and the ability of any individuals within the population to have any kind of weaponry, any kind of arms or the means of resistance. So this disarmament of Punjab in a structured, policy, institutionalized way was meant to break the material capacity of resistance and replace the sovereign power of the Khalsa, of the Sikh people, with dependence on imperial power and the colonial state. And then going a layer beyond that was the imposition of an administrative structure that reoriented, reorganized, and restructured Punjab from the level of the individual farm to the village to the entire nation and the people as a whole in that region. Agrarian life was forcibly reshaped through colonial land settlements, revenue systems, canal colonies, and bureaucratic control. Western education institutions were introduced as mechanisms to produce subjects who could serve the empire and reproduce the colonial order. So the police, courts, prisons, and military recruitment were used to reorganize Punjab to make it governable for imperial power. So for nearly a century, this colonial edifice repressed political life in the subcontinent, across that entire region, but in particular with a relentless brutality in Punjab against the Sikh people. It rewarded those who collaborated with imperial structures and punished those who insisted on Sikh autonomy and sovereignty. And so it's this experience and this process of colonial state building that brings us to 1947. So the official narrative of India that they amplified throughout the world is that 1947 was a moment of independence. But for the Sikh people, the experience of 1947 reveals something much more complicated and much more violent than than is spoken about in those mainstream terms. So what occurred was not independence, and it wasn't liberation from colonial rule. It was a transfer of power over a colonial construct that has come to be called India. So Maninder Singh spoke earlier and mentioned that this idea of India is not a historic entity. It's not something that's natural that existed prior to colonialism. The British colonial state created the modern state of India as it exists today. And that moment of 1947 that India calls independence, it was actually institutionalized in a legal document called the Transfer of Power. So the British colonial state didn't dissolve its structures, it transferred control over the structure that it created. So that power was handed to a generation of politicians who were committed explicitly or implicitly to the creation of a centralized Hindu ethno-state that is coming to its culmination through today's ruling BJP and Narendra Modi. The state claimed this language of secularism and of being the largest democracy in the world, but its actual fabric, its foundation, the impulses, the vision, the values, and the ambitions of that ruling elite was shaped by upper caste Hindu majoritarian impulses. So in this framework, minorities are only tolerated to the extent that they accepted the authority, categories, and limits imposed by the government of India. And Sikhs understood this very quickly. From the moment of the transfer of power, Sikhs began organizing and mobilizing to reassert our own autonomy and our sovereignty on our own terms through our own institutions, and re-engaging in a negotiation in pursuit of a political settlement with the state of India. So this looked in a number of different ways, from constitutional recognition for the distinct identity of the Sikh people that is still denied and repressed by the government of India today in its constitution, and federal restructuring of governance in the region to ensure political autonomy, linguistic rights, and respect for Punjab's resources that were being exploited and looted by the central government in Delhi. Every single one of these major Sikh demands or calls for a political settlement or negotiation were outright rejected. And going a step further beyond that, they were criminalized and vilified in the media. So this is the important point when we start getting into the lead up of exactly how 1984 transpires, is that the Indian state didn't respond to Sikh political mobilization as a democratic entity engaging with its people. It responded as a colonial successor state confronting a population that refused to be assimilated. And this is why the continuity from 1849 to 1984 is so important. The British colonial state aspired to assimilate or annihilate Sikh sovereignty and the Sikh people. And the Indian state post-1947 inherited that same structural position, that vision, and that interest. It used different language, it invoked this constitution, it invoked nationalism, it invoked the discourse and narrative of security and of development. But the underlying aim remained consistent throughout and continues until this day, to erase every element of Sikh sovereignty, of Sikh culture, of Sikh being that stands outside the authority of the centralized Indian Hindu state. So this modern state of India, this colonial edifice, has relentlessly undermined and repressed minority communities, nationalities, and communities all across India, including Adivasis, Dalits, Muslims, Christians, Kashmiris, Nagas, Manipuris, Tamils, and many others. And this is how the artificial Indian nation has been welded together, through coercion, surveillance, and militarization, and the suppression of communities whose histories don't fit within this myth of the Indian nation and this Indian civilization. And so Punjab was one of the clearest sites of this contradiction and of this resistance. After 1947, despite all of these attempts by the Sikh people to renegotiate some kind of political settlement and restructure the governance of the region, Sikh political demands became impossible for the Indian state to contain through its own established mechanisms. The Anandpur Sahib resolution, which was passed in the 70s, articulated a vision of federal autonomy, of decentralization, and respect for the rights of Punjab, and recognition of the Sikh people as a political nation, as a Guru Khalsa Panth, that has been recognized by states and global powers throughout our entire history. But rather than engaging with this political vision and with these demands, the Indian state framed this entire document and the Sikh movement at that time as extremism. So the Indian state created and manufactured the conditions in which a military assault on Sri Darbar Sahib was represented to the world as a security operation rather than an attack on the core of the Sikh people in order to subjugate and repress our people. And the period following 1984 continued the same trajectory with the same purpose and the same structures and mechanisms. Punjab was subjected to massive militarization, of enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, torture, mass cremations, and the criminalization of Sikh political life and religious life. And that logic continues today, decades later, and is now crossed and extended beyond India's own borders. India's transnational repression of Sikhs in the diaspora is simply the internationalization of India's long-standing domestic policy. So Sikh activists, institutions, and leaders outside of India are now being targeted because the demand for Sikh sovereignty and an independent Khalistan continues to survive and thrive beyond the territorial control of the Indian state and its security apparatus. And so this is why the historic trajectory is important. Because whether you look at 1849 to 1947, 1947 to 1984, or 1984 to 2026, India's objective remains consistent, is to assimilate or annihilate the Sikh people as a sovereign political community. But as this conference and of the resilience of the Sikh people all around the world has shown, this objective has failed. Individuals across the world, leaders in our community, including members who are sitting on the table with me today, have faced threats against themselves, to their lives, and the lives of their loved ones and their families for engaging in this work and advocating for an independent Khalistan, for speaking up about Sikh culture and the Sikh vision of Sarbata da Pala, of justice, and this idea of Hale Miraj. So India's objective has fundamentally failed. It failed under the British. It failed in 1984. It failed in the counterinsurgency, the genocide that spread over a decade, and it's failing today. So despite the threats and violence, the Sikh people remain committed to the establishment of an independent Khalistan as the necessary political expression of Sikh sovereignty and the collective liberation of the entire region and the decolonization of this global order as it stands today. And the struggle continues with certainty that no empire, no state, and no campaign of transnational repression can try to extinguish or repress or stamp out the sovereignty of the Sikh people. Thank you. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
I'd like to thank Prabhjot Singh for his comments. As we kind of progress through this, I would like to kind of just point out that the day today is really focused on an opportunity to understand the Sikh people, the ties between the Sikh people and this land, and also the events of 1984 and genocide. When we talk about genocide, the first thing that comes to mind, most people, is we refer to the Holocaust. What happened in Nazi Germany and throughout Europe in the Second World War is something that everyone here, I'm thinking as students of political science or law, that you would have some recollection of what those events were. I'd like to give you a small kind of indication as to like what we're talking about here, and then you can kind of understand why the Sikh position is very similar in light when it comes to why we're saying genocide over and over again, and how that actually should make sense. In June of 1984, after the Darbar Sahib attack, and after November 1984's genocide, there was multiple quotes that came out in the public atmosphere that I want to share a few of them with you so you understand what that actually, that violence was, how deep-rooted it was, how organized it was. And I quote, "Within a period of 3 days, almost 3,000 Sikhs were murdered and human rights of thousands more were violated. The aim was to silence the demand for Sikh religious and political autonomy that was by the United States Commission on International Religious Freedoms." Another quote, "Thousands of Sikh homes in Punjab villages have been raided. Young Sikhs dragged away for questioning, never to be seen again." That was from 1985 in The Guardian. And finally, Marianne Weaver reported in the Christian Science Monitor in 1984 that all males between the ages of 15 and 35 are trussed and blindfolded, then taken away. Thousands have disappeared in Punjab since the army operations began in June of 1984. These are most individuals probably the same age as many of you that are in seats here today. Many of your elders, many of your past family members would have been subjected to similar types of atrocities and human rights abuses. And this is where that shared resilience, that shared solidarity comes into play, that we're here speaking to you in an opportunity to discuss further what these shared experiences, the shared resilience, the shared struggle can be, and how we can actually ensure that a brighter future exists for everyone. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to the second panelist, Mr. Devinderjeet Singh. Devinderjeet Singh is a coordinator for the Sikh Federation of UK, a longtime advocate for Sikh sovereignty in the form of Khalistan. He's a member of the Secretariat for the Sikh Federation International, and his speaking topic today will be around the implications of genocide and the legal mechanisms that actually define genocide. Mr. Devinderjeet Singh, thank you.
I'm going to start with saying the Sikh salutation, Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. I'm going to keep this very focused on the events of Amritsar, June 1984. And the central question I'm going to address is from a legal and fact-based perspective. And the question is this: does the Amritsar June 1984 Indian state violence constitute a genocide? And what I'm going to set out in the next few minutes, focusing simply on June 1984, is the term genocide was coined in the 1940s by a Jewish Polish lawyer, Raphael Lemkin. It combines the Greek word genos, which is race or tribe, with the Latin word side, to kill. And these are really things you must keep in your mind as I go through this presentation. Genocide is the deliberate and systematic destruction in whole or part of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Genocide is widely considered the gravest crime against humanity. According to Article 2 of the 1948 UN Convention on Genocide, it requires a certain threshold. There must be an proven intent to destroy a protected group. There is no doubt Sikhs are a protected group. We're not just a religious group, we're also an ethnic, racial group. And I'm going to set out the evidence to prove the Indian state's intent to establish that June 1984 did, in fact, constitute a genocide. In the context of Amritsar, June 1984, I'm going to look at the UN legal definition of what a genocide is. And I'm going to concentrate on three aspects. One aspect of the definition is the killing of Sikhs, and that's why I'm largely going to focus on. But there's also causing serious bodily or mental harm to Sikhs. And thirdly, deliberately inflicting on Sikhs conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or part. You only need to prove one of those things. There's two others as well, which I won't go into. However, in practice, it's proved exceptionally difficult to prove genocide in international courts. To be legally classified as a genocide, perpetrators must explicitly intend to destroy the group itself, not just individual members. India does not accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Therefore, the only option is to go to one of the 153 nations that have signed the UN Convention on Genocide. Each of those 153 countries are obliged to introduce national laws so you could, through your national courts, prosecute another country or individuals from that country that have been involved in a genocide. The Sikhs that are here from the US, from Canada, from UK, from Australia, from Germany, from Switzerland, all have enshrined in legislation the ability to prosecute genocide. But because we're in Azerbaijan, you also have laws that can be used. You are one of those 153 countries. Your criminal code, Article 103, has got the ability to prosecute those involved in genocide. But similarly, I could quote the legislation in other countries. So the question we face is, will any court in the 153 nations put India in the dock? If these criminals from India could be prosecuted in any of these countries, that's one way of getting accountability. And if it's proven in a court, then the other 152 nations have to accept that at government level. In the past, Sikhs have tried political approaches, whether they be in provinces, in Canada, in states in America, or in what we call local authorities in the UK. And I think it's also been tried in Australia. But those are political processes. Because I'm addressing the legal framework, it's actually getting a court decision, and I could talk about November 1984, I could talk about Operation Woodrose that happened between June 1984 and November, and when I could talk about the decade of disappearances, fake encounters. But because I'm going to focus on June 1984, I'm going to now set out the evidence base. It was pre-planned. This wasn't something that was done overnight. And I'm going to present the evidence that's available to say it's pre-planned. The government of India said this was a last resort. However, retired Lieutenant General Sinha of the Indian Army said it was not the last resort. He said for more than 18 months, in 1982, the Army began rehearsals of a commando raid in the Doon Valley, where a complete replica of the Golden Temple complex was built. There's evidence available from the Indian Army to say that wasn't the only training they did. In March 1983, the British High Commissioner wrote to Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister. We have that piece of paper from UK government papers. In March 1983, more than 14 months before the massacre, the genocide, he wrote to Margaret Thatcher and said, if the Indian Army entered the Golden Temple, there will be a bloodbath. We have the evidence to take India to court on the basis of it. It was pre-planned. However, I'm not going to stop there. It was not an attack to simply remove so-called militants from the Golden Temple. The whole of Punjab was closed to the world. The media were expelled, communication lines were cut, and 150,000 paramilitary were sent to the Punjab. You do not send that level of force to remove a handful of people from the Golden Temple. We heard in the video 75 other Gurdwaras, other than the Golden Temple, were simultaneously attacked. The Canadian government have quoted a figure of 125 Gurdwaras. But what I would argue, and argue very strongly, the Indian Army went to village by village, and they went into every single Gurdwara in every single village. These tend to be the big, large Gurdwaras that often are referred to, because they were looking for young men, often between the ages of 15 and 35, and over 100,000 were disappeared within 4 weeks of June 1984 that Maninder Singh referred to. So it was not simply to attack a few individuals. So I think we meet the definition, the UN definition, that it was pre-planned and it was to wipe out Sikhs. And finally, before I'll give other quotes that Maninder Singh didn't give, because they're not our quotes, it's the quotes of people that were there. The day chosen was the martyrdom of the fifth Guru. They knew there was maximum numbers of pilgrims that would be there. Over 10,000 shoes were never claimed by the pilgrims that were there. You saw those pictures. Pictures do not lie. Those bodies lying around the most central of Sikh institutions. I'm now just going to finish with a few of these quotes. The Associated Press correspondent, Brahma Chelani, he managed to dodge being expelled from the Punjab. He remained in Amritsar. And he said one of the attendants of the city's cremation told him there was not enough wood to burn the dead individually. They ran out of wood to cremate the thousands of bodies. The Guardian, on the 13th of June 1984, said it was a virtual massacre. A large number of women, children, and pilgrims were gunned down. Meninda referred to the Christian Science Monitor. On the 8th of June, and I'll read you the full quote, for 5 days, the Punjab is cut off from the rest of the world. There is 24-hour curfew. All telephone and telex lines are cut. No foreigners are permitted entry. All journalists have been expelled. There are no newspapers, no trains, no buses. Not even a bullock cart can move. Orders to shoot on sight were widely carried out. The whole of Punjab, with its 5,000 villages and 50 major cities, were turned into a concentration camp. Think of the Holocaust. I'm very conscious of time. There are several other quotes that have come to show those killed were not just men that were fighting an armed struggle. There were many women, many elderly, many children. And this was eyewitnesses. And therefore we have every right to take the Indian state to a court in one of those 153 countries and to put India in the dock and to prove Amritsar, June 1984, was indeed a genocide. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Thank you, Devinderjeet Singh, on the legal contextualization of genocide, something that is an important kind of piece on what the Sikh Federation is globally working on right now. We have recognition of genocide at some municipal and state levels in places like Canada and the United States, working on it globally, ensuring that if it happens at the international level and agencies like the United Nations, allows the Sikh people then to ensure that not only do states then have obligations to hold India accountable, but a process that is delayed 40 years can actually take place, which is humanizing the victims of a genocide, ensuring that the trauma inflicted upon them is something that they receive help for, that they receive recognition for, and sometimes after victims of torture or victims of genocide, something that's most essential to them becomes just the recognition that they are actually recognized, their loss is recognized, they're recognized as human beings, and that is something that is the biggest thing that they can actually get in the form of justice, because 40 years later, you are not able to bring their loved ones back, you're not able to bring their children back, you're not able to bring their husbands or wives or grandfathers and grandmothers back. The loss is the loss, but even one step further, that humiliation of not even recognized as human, that is something that genocide recognition will allow for the victims of any genocide in the world, including the Sikh genocide. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to our final panelist for the first panel, Brahmdeep Kaur from the United States. She's a member of the Sikh Federation America, young and upcoming Sikh leader in America and North America right now. And she is going to be speaking about June 1984 eyewitness accounts of the invasion of Amritsar. And this will be a little bit more personal, the idea of the Sikh psyche, along with eyewitness accounts, which are extremely important, again, in humanizing the victims, that what they went through is only what they know what they went through. If somebody has been beaten, broken, raped, tortured, only they know what their body has experienced or their mind has experienced. And these are things that have to come from the eyewitnesses themselves or the individuals where this violence was perpetrated upon. So I'd like to ask Brahmdeep Kaur for the next 15 minutes that she will share with you some eyewitness accounts of 1984. Thank you.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you everyone for being here today, and thank you for the introduction. I'll be centering my talk with the importance of language, testimony, and the enduring Sikh ethos of Chardikla and resistance via eyewitness accounts of 1984. As my fellow panelists have said, we're framing transnational repression against Sikhs in the diaspora and continued oppression faced by Sikhs in Punjab as an extension of genocide, specifically the June 1984 genocide in Amritsar and across Punjab by the Indian authoritarian state. For us Sikhs, we use a different word, the word Kalukara. It's the Sikh term for a large-scale massacre, genocide, persecution, aggression of Sikhs. It became used first with the 1746 Shota or small Kalukara and the 1762 Vadda Kalukara. The genocidal campaign in 1984 by the Indian state is termed as a Kalukara as well by the community. This is a reclaiming of language, as the Indian name Operation Blue Star is not used by us. Its usage by the state, however, does confirm, as Devinderjeet Singh said, their calculated and premeditated military attack on unassuming pilgrims at the physical center of the Sikh spiritual and political institutions of the Darbar Sahib and Akal Takht Sahib in Sri Amritsar. We refer to the resistance on the first week of June as Jang Hind Punjab, the battle between Hindustan, the other word for India, and Punjab. Each Kalukara was also marked with days-long battles against the aggressors in the past. This spirit of fighting back in defense of Sikh sovereignty, institutions, a preparedness of each Sikh to fight for righteousness. This spirit is what has made Sikhs the target of state violence during the Mughal rule, invasions, religious persecution, British colonialism, and the colonial project and government of India today. Kalukara encompasses both this battle and state violence of 1984, of tens of thousands of non-combatants and the over 200 warriors that defended the Akal Takht Sahib and Sri Darbar Sahib in Amritsar. Both were in firm resistance of state violence and attempted and targeted erasure of Sikhs. They went to Darbar Sahib. They went there in despite of the fact that there was already continued state violence occurring, and they were unwavered by it of the risk of being a Sikh visible and committed to their faith. By remaining there, offering their heads, defending the women, the children, the elderly, as they were lined up, executed, their turbans and scarves thrown off, sprayed with bullets, and bloodied, as they stood for Dharam, righteousness, and their Guru, and Sikhi. I'd like to start with some examples of these testimonies and stories that have been incredibly emotional and will show you the spirit of Sikhs who were in Darbar Sahib at that time and afterwards in the genocide. First is the family of Bhai Mohar Singh, Bibi Paramjit Kaur, Bibi Satnam Kaur, and Bibi Vaheguru Kaur. Bibi Satnam Kaur and Vaheguru Kaur were children, young girls at the ages of 6 and 8, who, when their father was asked to leave by the people who were hoping to get women and children out, replied with, "Don't ask us to leave, because we won't. We will not. We have already made the journey and the ardas, the ask and prayer of Shahidi." Shahidi is the name for martyrdom in Sikhi. We will become martyrs in the presence and protection of our Guru. The second testimony I would like to give is of Sant Jarnail Singh Ji Khalsa Pindrawale. Sant Jarnail Singh Ji was the Sikh leader that was present inside of the complex and was responsible for bringing awareness to Sikh issues in India at that moment, and served as a political and spiritual leader for Sikhs at the time and continues to be today. He became Shaheed during 1984 in June while in defense. Sant Jarnail Singh Ji, as people gathered around him on June 3rd, in silence, waiting for his orders, what to do as the Indian army gathered around the complex, encroached closer and closer on them, having already killed so many innocent Sikhs, bystanders, pilgrims, protesters, fighters. In that moment, after a pin drop, silent pause, Santji said to the men around him, "The time has come where we must give our heads. It is our responsibility, our honor, and our path to give our heads. Nothing less is expected of us in this moment." There's also the story of the man, the fighter, who wanted to make sure that his face, his turban, his dastar, his identity remained intact, so the tyrants and the world knew, when seeing his dead body, that he had given his life valiantly for righteousness. In the over 108 Gurdwara Sahibs that were attacked during the first week of June, people flocked to defend those Gurdwara Sahibs. Gurdwara Sahibs are temples and places of worship for Sikhs. Other people around the area of Amritsar formed groups to quickly go and defend and enter the city of Amritsar, as they heard, despite the media blackout, what was occurring. And instead, they were shot and killed by the army waiting there. They all didn't even entertain the possibility of risk, and we strive to follow their steps. Another testimony is that of the unknown woman who, in the later years of 1984, during the insurgency, was taken by the police, interrogated, sexually assaulted, and killed for simply not talking and giving the police the answers that they asked for. They didn't entertain the possibility of risk, not just for survival, but they knew that they had to resist, always. Resistance is not a choice for Sikhs, but a necessity. The word Kalugara binds us to the Sikh ethos, Sikh history of those Sikhs that fought and were killed during the 1746 and 1762 Kalugaras. The historic response to Kalugaras has always been the acceptance of death as hukam, command of Vaheguru, and Pana, submission to the will of Vaheguru, the resistance with the survival of the Sikhs, steadfastness and trust in their Sikhi, the fight for dharam, justice, and establishment of Halem Miraj, compassionate rule, all while remaining in Chardi Kala. Chardi Kala is the Sikh value of eternal optimism. So they were unwavering as they continued on. They always had the vision of Raj, rule, in mind. I would like to end with saying one saying that we have in Punjabi, and it's something that is said at almost every program, every event that we hold in commemoration, and every single day as we remember. Sada Pranam Shahidanu, eternal tribute to the martyrs. We honor and we give tribute to the brave men and women of the Sikh community who were tortured, disappeared, fought in defense of righteousness, the orphaned and martyred children who resisted by refusing to stay silent and were cremated anonymously and thrown into rivers, families who have no idea what occurred. I pay tribute to the families of those shaheeds who have stories of hiding as they lay in wait of their regular police calls, knowing that if they were taken, they didn't want to risk the lives of their family, but most importantly, their own values. They knew they had to remain as they hid away from the police, as they continuously taught their children who had fathers that had already been disappeared and killed, what their stories were, what happened. And we continue to pass on that as we build solidarity with everyone else here today. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Brahmdeep Kaur for very emotional and also inspirational commentary around eyewitness accounts and the importance of actually capturing those accounts to make sure that people's words, their experiences, not only their trauma, but their resilience also lives on as well. That concludes our first panel for this morning. We'll be moving into our second panel before the break. In our second panel, we will be speaking about diaspora memory, trauma, and resistance. For us as Sikhs, it is not just about victimhood. It is not just about behaving and acting as victims. Resilience, sovereignty, and most especially the idea of resistance is something that is core to our values, is core to our being, and is something that we constantly strive for to ensure that we are not seen solely as victims, we are sovereigns in our own right as well. So before I start the second panel here with our panelists, I did want to just point out one story that just came to mind quickly as we kind of move through this. In the diaspora, we have many people that have left the land of Punjab. So when we're talking to you about genocide, we're talking to you about violence, we're talking to you about trauma, there are many people that live in our diaspora communities that actually carry this with them every day. We had a mother that was speaking to us most recently. She lives in England now. One of her sons lives in Germany, the other one lives in Spain, and none of them are able to sometimes see each other on a regular basis because they are stuck in the countries they are in. And this mother, actually, when her husband was killed, she was tortured. She was imprisoned for almost 8 years. One of her sons was taken by the police, and she never knew where he was. For 7, 8 years after she came out of prison, she searched for him. She couldn't find him. And by chance, she lost this child when he was approximately 3 to 4 years old. And by chance, he was found again by the time he was 13 or 14 years old. But 10 years of life of a child that's 3 or 4 without your mother. And this is a story that is not just one woman's story or one people's story. This is a global story when injustice, tyranny, oppression is allowed to activate itself and it's not challenged. So when we speak about victimhood or we talk about the victims of these genocides, there is a deep resilience in the love of a mother trying to find her child decades later and being able to be reunited. But there are many, many hundreds of more stories of where that child was never found, that grave was never found, that cremation ground was never found all across the world. So in light, there is a resilience, there's a never-ending hope of a child returning home. And that is something that we're here to capture today as well, that it's not just about being a victim, it's the fact that the Sikh community goes through trials and tribulations, and then we actually come out stronger on the other end, regardless of the torture, the trauma, the genocide that we go through, that we double our numbers, we come back doubling down on our resilience, on our quest for sovereignty in the form of Khalistan, that these things will not break us. So as we move into the second panel on diaspora, memory, trauma, and resistance, our first speaker is Mandeep Singh. He's a member of the Sikh Federation USA. He comes to us as a member of the Secretariat for the Sikh Federation International, and his topic of discussion will be on intergenerational memory and cultural transmission. Mandeep Singh.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. First of all, I would like to thank you, Baku Initiative, for organizing this event. My topic is intergenerational memory and cultural transmission in Sikh diaspora. I just wanted to go over what is intergenerational memory and cultural transmission. There are two concepts that are deeply linked. Intergenerational memory is what gets passed on, such as historical events, collective traumas, values, identity, and moral obligations. Culture transmission, on the other hand, is how it travels. So oral storytelling, narrative, rituals, ceremonies, sacred texts, and scriptures, and embodies practices, things learned through doing rather than just reading. The Sikh narrative fundamentally rejects the idea that the memory is simply an emotional exercise in grief. From the earliest Shahidi literatures to the documents relating to the Battle of Amritsar, memories has always been active, a form of political mobilization and a transmission of Patshahi, sovereignty, from one generation to the next. The question for the diaspora is not just do we remember, but how do we remember, and toward what purpose? Our shaheeds are not historical artifacts frozen in 1984 or 1995. They are towers of light that actively guide each generation through specific struggles. This is a fundamentally different conception of memory than the Western trauma studies framework, which tends to fix victims in victimhood. In the Sikh framework, figures like Bhai Jaswant Singh Khalra did not simply die. Their shahadat continues to author the future. The task of cultural transmission is to keep this understanding alive rather than reducing our shaheeds to mere human rights statistics. To remember in this way is to refuse the tyranny of linear time. The Western historians place 1984 in a sealed past and measures the distance between now and then. The Gursikh stands inside the Sakha simultaneously with every Singh that has fought to their last breath. This is why our dates fold into one another, from first Kalukara to the second to the third, from 1746, 1762, and 1984, are not separate tragedies arranged on a timeline, but a single reoccurring confrontation between sovereignty and subjugation. When the Sangat rises in Ardas and evokes those who gave their heads but not their faith, the Shaheeds are not summoned from distant past. They are already present, standing in the Hajuri of the Guru. Memory here is not remembrance, it is presence. When the youth learns about June 84, the goal is not simply to inform them of the injustice, but to connect them to a timeless pattern of Sikh resistance. Drawing the line from Chamkaur Sahib to every Kalukara before, in it and the third Kalukara of our own time. We draw those parallels not because we are shocked, but because we are reminded of our inherent strength. There are two distinct enemies of this memory. The first is the active state distortion, framing Operation Blue Star as a law and order exercise, the suppression of evidence, digital repression used to silence the Sikh voices. The second, and perhaps more dangerous in the diaspora, is Gulami, the gradual subjugation of Sikh consciousness through assimilation into Western liberal frameworks. Just as the colonial education systems trained people to reject their own culture, diaspora youth face the danger of absorbing secularized individualistic frameworks and losing the Gurmat lens through which the Sikh memory has always been transmitted. The Gurdwara is not merely a place of worship. It is a sovereign Sikh space where an alternative way of being is practiced and preserved. The Jujarus of 1984 are celebrated around the world through music, art, and katha. This intergenerational cultural transmission in its most organic form. The Sangat acting as a living community of memory that bypasses both state narratives and the pressure to assimilate. Rebuilding autonomous Sikh institutions is simultaneously a call to rebuild the infrastructure of cultural transmission itself. And this transmission cannot be done authentically through the language of liberal human rights alone. It must travel through Gurbani, through Naam, through the Guru Sikhya and Parampara. That has always been the primary vehicle of Sikh knowledge. When communities transmit the Sakha of June 1984 through Kirtan and Ardas, rather than only through protest and marches, they are enacting the principle that spiritual and temporal sovereignty are inseparable. Sikh Sangharsh and Shahadat have always been understood as a victory to be celebrated, not merely mourned. This challenges trauma-centered frameworks that recklessly teach the next generation to see themselves primarily as victims. Chardi Kala is the emotional and spiritual register through which the memory is transmitted. The youth of the diaspora inherited not just the wounds of 1984, but the courage and sovereign dignity of those who fought with unwavering conviction. Memory is not an archive we preserve behind glass. It is a blueprint we live by. The task of this generation is to ensure that what is transmitted is not just grief, but the sovereign, Gurmat-rooted capacity to act, organize, and build Halemi Raj in our own time. In the end, there is a line recited at the close of every Sikh prayer, Raj Karega Khalsa. The Khalsa shall be sovereign. To an outside ear, that may sound like a claim to a political power. It is not. It is a claim that a people's dignity cannot be granted or revoked by any state. That sovereignty is something you carry, not something you're given. That is what you mean when we say memory is not an archive, it is a blueprint. The question I leave you with is whether the event of 1984 were an injustice. It is whether you will hear how a community chose to remember them, not as victims, but as successors. Thank you. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Thank you, Mandeep Singh. As we move into the second speaker, Sukhwinder Singh, who's the Executive Director of the Sikh Federation UK and a member of the Sikh Secretariat for the Sikh Federation International, whose topic will be trauma, displacement, and community resilience. I think one of the things you're hearing about more and more here is the idea that we are not going to just subject ourselves to being just victims. There is being a victim of torture, of violence, but then there's also coming out the other side of it. And the reclaiming of your dignity, of your honor, is something that Sikhs know well how to do. So while we are standing here conversing about events in the past that have led us to the present day, make no mistake that the Sikh people are looking for solidarity and partners. We are not looking for just sympathy. These are important things for us as individuals to understand because we are a sovereign people. We have had a sovereign nation and a sovereign rule for a period of almost 100 years between the mid-1700s and the mid-1800s. In one way, shape, or form, a Sikh kingdom existed in the northern areas of what is modern-day India and Pakistan. So when we talk about Khalistan, we are not speaking about something new. We're talking about a dignity and a sovereignty that was once lost, and the reclaiming of that sovereignty in its modern form and context in the form of Khalistan, which we believe today will ensure that the Sikh people have a bright future with dignity, with respect, with the protection of their culture, their language, their heritage, and their faith. And these are things that we strive to build with other partners in other communities, like in Azerbaijan and like in other partners around the world. So I will turn it over to Sukhwinder Singh to speak with you today about trauma, displacement, and community resilience. After him, we have one more speaker, and then we will have our break for the day. Sukhwinder Singh.
Good morning, academics and students. It's an honor for me to speak today at the University of Baku. On my professional basis, I also work at a university in the United Kingdom, where I'm not an academic, but head of equality. So it's great to see another university, another location. I'm not going to cover a lot of issues my colleagues have already said, but I'm going to build on those. So we're gathered today not only to remember June 1984, but to interrogate its continuing consequences and to bear witness to the human suffering that still echoes across generations. The assault on Sri Harmandir Sahib during Operation Blue Star was not simply a military action confined to one place or one moment in history. For Sikhs around the world, it was experienced as a collective wound, one that entered homes, families, places of worship, and the deepest parts of communal memory. What unfolded in June 1984 became the beginning of a wider architecture of fear, surveillance, trauma, impunity, displacement, and silence that extended far beyond Punjab and far beyond India's borders. Today, in the language of contemporary human rights discourse, many of these patterns would be recognized as elements of transnational repression. And I'm not going to focus on transnational repression because it's a topic that will be covered later on by my colleagues. So for many Sikhs, Sikh communities worldwide, June 1984 was not the end of violence, it marked the beginning of a prolonged global condition of fear, grief, political vulnerability, and unresolved trauma. As mentioned earlier, during Operation Blue Star, the Indian Army entered Sri Harmandir Sahib during one of the most spiritually significant periods of the Sikh calendar, when thousands of pilgrims had gathered in prayer and commemoration of the Shahidi of Guru Arjan Dev Ji. Many of those trapped inside were ordinary civilians. There were pilgrims, there were mothers and fathers, there were children who had come with their families to bow their heads in devotion. There were elderly worshippers who believed they were standing in one of the safest and most sacred places in the world. Instead, they found themselves caught in gunfire, explosions, panic, and chaos. For countless Sikh families, the trauma did not begin with politics. It began with the unbearable reality that innocent civilians died inside their own holy sanctuary. Many survivors later, and we've had some quotes from various journalists and newspapers, recalled the bodies lying unattended, terrified families separated in confusion, wounded pilgrims unable to access medical assistance, and pilgrims trapped for days without food, water, or safe passage. And June is one of the hottest periods within India. Now these, as has been identified earlier on by my colleagues, these have been captured and documented in a number of books and journals. And my colleagues spoke about official figures by the Indian government, which says approximately 575 deaths. Other eyewitnesses and journalists and human rights activists actually estimate the figures ranging between 1,000 and 3,000 deaths. But what's more important is not the statistic or the number, because behind that is a human life. A father, a son who never returned home. A mother whose family waited endlessly for answers. A child whose final moments unfolded amid violence inside a sacred place of prayer. The emotional devastation caused by the assault on Sri Harmandir Sahib and the Akal Takht cannot be understood solely through military or political language. As highlighted earlier on, the Akal Takht is not merely a building, it is a spiritual and temporal center of Sikh identity. To witness it damaged by tanks and artillery, for many Sikhs, was like witnessing the desecration of collective memory itself. The former British Foreign Secretary, William Hague, acknowledged this in the UK Parliament in 2014, when he stated, and I quote, "This loss of life was an utter tragedy. Understandably, members of the Sikh community around the world still feel the pain and suffering caused by those events." And again, as highlighted earlier, the destruction of the Sikh reference library deepened this pain immeasurably. Its destruction was experienced by many Sikhs not merely as collateral damage, but as an assault on memory itself. My colleague earlier on quoted Raphael Lemkin the jurist who coined the term genocide. And he talked about certain elements and definitions of genocide. But there's another a definition, which is that genocide not only involves the destruction of people, but the desecration of culture and historical existence. And that was by the destruction of the reference library. The violence of 1984 did not remain within the borders of Punjab. It traveled. It crossed oceans and borders through refugees, migrants, students, survivors, and grieving families who carried invincible wounds into countries such as the UK, Canada, the United States, Germany, and Australia, to mention a few. Many who left Punjab carried memories they could never fully speak about. Some carried the memory of losing loved ones. Others carried memories of disappearances, arbitrary detention, torture, military raids, humiliation. Many carried survivor's guilt and many silence. The sociologist Kai Erikson once described collective trauma as a blow to the basic tissues of social life that damages the bonds attaching people together. That description applies powerfully to the Sikh experience after 1984. Across diaspora communities, gurdwaras became more than places of worship. They became spaces of mourning, spaces of testimony, spaces of political education, oral history preservation, legal advocacy, and communal healing. Across London, Birmingham, Vancouver, Toronto, New York, and Melbourne, Sikh communities organized vigils, remembrance events, oral history projects, and documentaries. When institutions failed to preserve truth, ordinary people became custodians of memory. They documented testimonies when official institutions remained silent. They preserved photographs when archives disappeared. And they taught younger generations about 1984 because they feared silence would become another form of erasure. The scholar, and I'll finish very soon, the scholar Stanley Cohen, in his work on state denial, argued that governments frequently respond to atrocities through literal denial, interpretative denial, and implicitly denial. The Sikh diaspora has challenged all three. Firstly, by insisting the violence be remembered. Secondly, by documenting the scale and nature of abuses. And thirdly, by demanding moral and legal responsibility. For many Sikhs, the struggle after 1984 has therefore not only been about justice, it has been about recognition. Recognition that innocent civilians suffered. Recognition that families continue to live with unresolved grief. And recognition that memory itself becomes politicized. These dynamics align closely with contemporary definitions of transnational repression. And again, I'm not going to touch too much on that. My final comments are very much around the issue, therefore, as identified by colleagues, is not about the past. It is about the continuing governance of memory. Who has the right to narrate 1984? Who determines legitimate grief? Who has the right to mourn openly without fear? And who is permitted to demand justice without being criminalized? And yet, despite decades of grief, silence, intimidation, the Sikh diaspora has continued to resist erasure. Where accountability was absent, communities built memory. Where archives vanished, they became archives themselves. Where silence prevailed, they became the voices. And that is why diaspora remembrance must never be dismissed as nostalgia or grievance politics. It is fundamentally a human rights project. It is an act of moral survival. It's an insistence that state violence cannot be normalized through times. And it is a declaration that innocent lives lost in 1984 will not disappear from history simply because powerful institutions wish them forgotten. Thank you.
So thank you to Sukhwinder Singh, who's the Executive Director of Sikh Federation UK, for speaking about the trauma and displacement and the resilience of our community, that despite the adversities, the challenges, the massacre and genocide that our community has undergone, that our community still remains steadfast and resolute in our determination for an independent Khalistan. So next I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Navraj Kaur, who's a graduate student and one of our young leaders of Sikh Federation of America. She's going to be speaking about diaspora activism, narrative building, and global solidarity. Navraj Kaur.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. The Sikh diaspora has not only preserved the memory of 1984, it has actively challenged state narratives, built institutions of advocacy and education, internationalized the Sikh struggle, and created solidarities with other communities facing state violence and repression. This work is not separate from Sikhi. It is rooted in truth, seva, selfless service, sangharsh, struggle, and the responsibility of the Panth, the Sikh community. My focus today is on what the Sikh community in the diaspora has done with the memory of 1984 and the decades of violence that followed. Building on from what others have already mentioned about intergenerational trauma, memory, and focus on the active work of the diaspora, its activism, the narrative building, and global solidarity. Many Sikh families in the diaspora carry 1984 through fragments: a photo, a name, a speech at the Gurdwara, a picture of a shaheed in the Langar Hall, a story told quietly, a parent who refuses to explain, an elder who remembers too much, a child who feels the weight of something they did not directly witness. Sometimes such silence is mistaken for forgetting. But in many Sikh families, silence was not forgetting. As Mandeep Singh also discussed, this silence was fear. This silence was the result of surveillance and criminalization. Silence was knowing that speaking openly could have consequences for them and their family members back home. So when the diaspora speaks, documents, organizes, and remembers publicly, that is not just activism. It is breaking of that imposed silence as well. It is the refusal to let the state decide which Sikh stories can be spoken. Because the Sikh diaspora has not only remembered, the Sikh diaspora has organized, it has documented, it has protested, it has educated, it has built institutions, it has challenged state narratives. It has carried the Sikh struggle into the global spaces. And this work cannot simply be framed as political reaction. It is connected to truth, to seva, to sangharsh, and to the responsibility of the Panth to speak the truth before false power. Padshahi for Sikhs also means that Sikh sovereignty is not given by the state, it is not framed by the state. It is not granted by an empire, a parliament, a constitution, or an international body. Sikh sovereignty is bestowed upon the Sikhs by the Guru. And this matters because Sikhs are perceived as only religious minority, a cultural group, or a diaspora community. Sikhs are not simply asking to be included with another power's framework, The Guru Khalsa Panth carries its own sovereign being, its own Hond Hasti. This is why narrative matters so much. If Sikhs are understood only through the language of minority rights, then the idea of Sikh sovereignty disappears. And after June and November 1984, Sikh communities outside Punjab became crucial spaces for organizing. Diaspora activism, as I mentioned before as well, has taken many forms. And the Gurdwaras, the Sikh temples, became spaces of preserving memory and mobilization as well. Annual commemorations for the Shaheeds kept the stories alive. Families preserved testimonies. Human rights organizations such as Insaf.org documented disappearances, torture, illegal cremations, and impunity. Sikh journalists challenged the state narratives. Artists, poets, musicians, and writers carried memory into culture. Youth organizations created camps for younger children, social media campaigns, and public education. Everybody had a role in preserving this memory. Seva, also known as selfless service, is often reduced to feeding people or volunteering, which is a huge part of Seva, but Seva also means serving the Panth by protecting the truth. When a young Sikh learns the history of 1984, when they understand the meaning of the Akal Takht Sahib, when they learn about the disappeared, when they learn about political prisoners, when they understand the between Guru Nanak Sahib's teaching of the truth and today's Sangash, something changes. They are no longer simply inheriting trauma, they are inheriting responsibility as well. This matters because state violence does not only kill people, This matters because state violence does not only kill people, it also tries to control the record of what happened. It tries to decide whose suffering is visible and whose suffering is erased. Diaspora activism disrupted that erasure and challenged it. June 1984 was not only an attack on a physical site, it was an attack on the sovereign center of the Sikh Panth. The Akal Takht Sahib is not just a building, it represents the Guru-given authority of the Panth to speak, decide, and stand before the worldly power. So when the Indian army attacked Harmandir Sahib complex and the Akal Takht Sahib, Sikhs understood this is not as, Sikhs understood this not only as military violence, but as an assault on Sikh sovereignty itself. Which is why one of the most important parts of Sikh diaspora activism has been narrative building. The Indian state has often described Sikh resistance through words like extremism, terrorism, separatism, and tried to erase it in the name of law and order. These words are not neutral, they are political tools. They hide the context of state violence. They try to erase the attack on Akal Takht Sahib. They try to erase the disappeared. They try to erase the political prisoners. They erase the question of Sikh sovereignty. So for the Sikh diaspora, narrative building is not just about telling stories either. It is about challenging the language through which the world understands Sikh struggle. When the state controls the narrative, the victim becomes the threat, the survivor becomes a suspect, the political prisoner becomes invisible, the shaheeds become criminalized, and the demand for justice becomes extremism. And Sikh narrative building means naming this truth clearly as state violence, as genocide, as repression, as disappearances, as torture, and the denial of Sikh sovereignty. And in today's world, whoever controls the narrative controls what is seen and is ultimately seen as legitimate. The Panth must be able to narrate itself. If Sikh resistance is only understood through the state's language, the Sikh pain becomes irrelevant. Sikh organizing becomes dangerous and the demands of justice become unreasonable. But when Sikhs tell our own story, the frame changes. We are able to connect 1984 to a longer history of state violence. We are able to explain why the attack on Akal Takht was not only an attack on a building, but an attack on the Guru-given authority of the Panth. I want to close by saying that Sikh diaspora activism should not be understood only as a reaction to violence. It is also an assertion of who we are. It is an assertion that the Panth has the right to remember, speak, organize, and define itself and its struggle. It is assertion that Sikh history cannot be reduced to the state's categories. It is assertion that Sikh sovereignty is not extremism. It is the assertion that justice cannot be built on silence. The Sikh diaspora has carried 1984 and its history across borders not as a frozen wound, but as a living responsibility. Through activism, narrative building, global solidarity, Sikhs continue to resist erasure and carry forward the Guru Sahib's path of truth, dignity, and sovereign resistance. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Navraj Kaur for walking us through that. I know there's classes going on and many people are coming and going. So we do have a 10-minute break right now. I appreciate everyone that has given us the time and the energy for the last 2 hours. We do have a break for 10 minutes. We will be returning at 11:35 to continue, and we will have the afternoon panel that will continue on after the break. So we will come back and reconvene at 11:35, and now there is a 10-minute break. Thank you.
Yeah, all right.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the second portion of our panel discussion today on transnational repression, genocide, and the events of Amritsar in June of 1984. I'd like to thank you for your attention so far. As we move into the second part of this panel, we shift our attention not just from a historical perspective on genocide, on the mass amounts of violence, the victims from 1984, to speak more to the resilience of the Sikh community, the opportunities that we have before us, and at the same time, the solidarity networks that we're building globally to ensure that a safe and prosperous homeland for the Sikh people in the form of Khalistan is established. In the final two panels, these shifts in attention will draw upon more transnational repression, the threats that are existing globally to the Sikh community today, and the opportunities before them. Historically, we've had options, and that's something I wanted to speak about before I turn it over to the next panel, that we have options around working with states and nation states, and we have options as a people to work with solidarity and networks of individuals that are seeking their own freedom globally as well. This is not a situation of or, this is a situation of and for the Sikh community, meaning that we have both as partners. While we strive to work with NGOs, strive to work with other resistance movements, we strive to work with nation states and strive to work with governments as well. So in this kind of shape or form, the diaspora has the ability to utilize certain freedoms. We are going to go into the third panel, which is Transnational Repression, Global Patterns and Case Studies, and we'll be examining the extraterritorial targeting and surveillance of many individuals and the coercion of the Sikh people as a whole. So this topic is important for us because the diaspora Sikh community really keeps alive the full and focused conversation on the issue of Sikh sovereignty in Khalistan. That is important because the ultimate goal and justice for the Sikh people today is their own freedom. It does no longer exist within the judiciary, within the state narratives that the Indian government sets. In this situation, we can look at the diaspora as having certain freedoms of speech, freedom of expression, that they are able to actually utilize to get these information out to the global forums and global panels. If you look at India as a whole, I will give you one example that approximately 10 years ago, 3 Sikh boys that were in college and university, just like many of you here, they had books and literature with them that you could find at any bookstore. That books and literature were around the Sikh sovereignty movement and Sikh human rights. These individuals were picked up on sedition laws, which is waging war against the state of India. All 3 of those individuals were eventually given life imprisonment for owning books. Those 3 were used as a scare tactic to ensure that if 3 could be made an example of, then hundreds more or thousands more will go silent. And those individuals, their names, Ranjit Singh, Surjit Singh, and Ravinder Singh, are still in jail to this day. So this is the kind of pattern of repression that we're dealing with. And in 2023, 2 Sikh leaders, Avtar Singh Khanda, who lived in the United Kingdom, and Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who lived in Canada, both were targeted for assassination. And on June 15th, Avtar Singh Khanda was killed in the UK. Hardeep Singh Nijjar on June 18th was killed in Vancouver, Canada. And both individuals were prominent advocates of the Sikh sovereignty movement for Khalistan. In order to silence the 2 of them, they expected that they would silence all Sikhs that were living in the diaspora. The exact opposite happened. Thousands of Sikhs, hundreds of thousands of Sikhs came onto the streets in demonstrations and protests. Lobbying efforts, diplomacy efforts, and resistance efforts doubled. So we see that where the blood of a Sikh is spilt, whether it was in June of 1984 or it was in 2023, in both circumstances, almost 40 years apart, the Sikh community has been galvanized in its resistance, and it has been inspired to seek its freedom in the form of Khalistan. So in the afternoon panels, our first panel will consist of the first speaker, Devinderjeet Singh, who will speak about state mechanisms of cross-border repression, who he himself has seen the brunt of in the United Kingdom. So he will speak from both the personal experiences of the Sikh Federation in the UK and also from a practical experience of all Sikhs living in the diaspora. Devinderjeet Singh.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. When we mention the words transnational repression, this is a recent term that governments have developed. But for Sikhs, transnational repression started when Sikhs left Punjab. So when Punjab was divided in two in 1947, many Sikhs started to go to countries like the UK, Canada, America, Australia, and in more recent years to various European countries. But the issue of transnational repression, the first case of transnational repression, can be traced to the UK in 1971, when a leader there started to talk about Khalistan. If we fast forward, 1984, the events of Amritsar, June 1984, resulted in the Indian government saying, we can kill our own people by using tanks. However, what about all these millions of Sikhs living abroad? And in every country like the UK, Canada, America, where there were large numbers of Sikhs, they started surveillance. So in our places of worship, gurdwaras, they started collecting information. Who is outspoken? Who is speaking? Tens of thousands of Sikh names were collected from the UK alone, and we have proof of that from the BBC. How did they use that information? They then created blacklists of people that were not allowed to travel to Punjab, to India. There are members of our delegation that haven't been since the 1970s to Punjab. They've not seen their loved ones. Some of their loved ones are no longer here. They couldn't attend the funerals of their mothers, their fathers. This was the start of transnational repression. But following June 1984, the Indian government became a bit more sophisticated. They started putting pressure on foreign governments to suppress the Sikhs' voice. In the UK, we have evidence from UK government papers that were released 30 years after 1984, which showed they banned protests in the UK in 1984, so we could not raise our voice about that genocide. They leaned on the BBC and the ITV, which are the two main channels, not to cover Sikhs and interview them. They stopped us marking at sports tournaments the fact that Sikhs had been martyred in June 1984. These things, we have evidence, black and white, from UK government papers. But if it was happening in the UK, I can guarantee you it was happening in Canada, happening in America, where large numbers of Sikhs live. And because I'm going to keep this short, I'm going to fast forward to the events of the last 3 years. Maninder Singh talked about Avtar Singh Khanda in the UK, Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada, and the plot in America on Gurpatan Singh Pannu. Earlier this year, in a book called The Delhi Directive, the author who speaks to people right at the top of Indian intelligence said India had killed 67 people abroad. They're not all Sikhs. Some are Kashmiris, some are others. So they are eliminating their opponents abroad in Pakistan and in various European countries. But those countries are often silent. They deal with India quietly. Canada, Justin Trudeau, took the step of going public. And that's why Sikhs that demand Khalistan, our independence, people, nations, NGOs are asking, why are they so worried about a tiny minority in India, less than 2%? Why are they so worried about the Sikhs? And I think that goes back to our origins as a faith, what we stand for, human rights activists, and we punch much higher than above our numbers. And I'll finish on this note, because I know other speakers will cover specifics. Transnational repression is probably the biggest issue that will potentially result in the breakup of India. And the reason why I say that is when governments start to take note that India does not recognize your sovereignty, will come on your soil to kill people, to silence them, then they know it's time that India should break up. The USSR broke up into 15 nations. Azerbaijan emerged from that. India is the same. It's made up of various states, different languages, very different people. I believe in our lifetime, we will see that breakup of India and an independent Sikh state, Khalistan, emerge. But at the same time, this does require governments to call out the most populous country in the world to say if India can get away with this and countries remain silent, then that is a free pass to any country to go into other countries and eliminate your opponents. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Thank you, Devinderjeet Singh, for walking us through that. I'd like to point out that the individuals that we're speaking about, Avtar Singh Khanda in the UK and Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada, for many of us, they were close friends and colleagues. We would see them regularly, if not every day, in some of our situations and relationships. So these are real people, like the people that are sitting beside you today. We're not talking about people that were living far away from us. These are people and individuals that were a part of our networks, a part of our families and relationships and friends, people that we would have dinner with, people that we would share in joy and in sorrow. So these are very real people that we're presenting to you. Before we move on to the next panelist, I do want to kind of just read out a small quote just to kind of bring us back to some of the ideas around genocide. Fake encounters happen all the time. We're seeing a ramp up of fake encounters in India again, meaning that young people especially, college students. We had a 19-year-old Ranjit Singh just a few months ago, and we spoke about him in the United Nations, that he was picked up from his home, and later that day he was murdered, and then an encounter was staged that he was shooting at the police, and he was killed in an encounter with police. And it's been known that Punjab police and the police in India and Indian security forces do this routinely. And one of the quotes I wanted to share from you was from Human Rights Watch, an internationally recognized human rights organization. In 1994, they released a report called India's Secret Army in Punjab. And in that, they declared that Punjab police routinely staged encounters in which detainees were executed and then falsely described as armed militants killed in a shootout. This is something that happens up until this day, today. We've seen hundreds of these fake encounters that are happening over the last several years, and it's only ramping up. And this happens when the Sikh community exercises its freedom of expression and speech, its actual claim to sovereignty and Khalistan, and this happens even more. So we have activists right now that are living globally within the Sikh community in the diaspora, who we're touching on right now, that we have dozens of them in the UK, in Canada, the US, Australia, Europe, that have duties to warn of imminent assassination to them, also to their spouses, and all the way down to their children. So we have the Indian government, and you have authorities in Canada that are warning activists that their children in schools, they could be killed by the Indian government if you don't stop your activity. So the very real and harsh reality of what the Sikh people are enduring right now adds to our resilience. It doesn't take away from us. It doesn't turn us into just victims like I was saying before. It actually gives us more resilience and more resistance that we have to stop this now before this continues on to another generation and another generation. And eventually a generation may go quiet. And we can't let that happen because that is essentially what states like India want. They want silence. And if they have silence, they win. So they don't need to necessarily kill you physically. If they kill you at the spirit level, at the conscience level, then basically that death is worse than the physical death in some way, shape, or form as well. So our next speaker is going to be Anita Lal. She's a representative of the Dalit community, and actually, sorry, I have that wrong. The next speaker is actually Harpreet Singh from the Sikh Federation. Harpreet is a member of the Sikh Federation of Canada, a long-standing activist within Sikh politics in Canada, and his topic here will cover off some of the realities of what the actual repression looks like. So taking a look at some of the case studies around what transnational repression and what that repression looks like in day-to-day Sikh activist lives. So Harpreet Singh, you have the floor.
Thank you. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Good afternoon. Thank you to the Baku Initiative Group for creating space for this important discussion on transnational repression, global intimidation tactics, and the lived experiences of diaspora communities. Today I want to focus specifically on the Sikh diaspora experience, particularly the growing concerns around intimidation, surveillance, coercion, and the fear that many Sikhs in Canada and around the world increasingly face because of foreign interference linked to the Indian state and its aligned networks. For many Canadians, the idea of transnational repression sounds abstract. It sounds like something that happens somewhere else in authoritarian countries far away from democratic societies like Canada. But for Sikhs, this is not theoretical, it's personal, it's current, and it's happening here. Transnational repression is not simply about spies or international politics. At its core, it's about exploring fear beyond borders. It is about attempting to silence voices abroad through intimidation, harassment, threats, online targeting, surveillance, economic pressure, and in the most extreme cases, violence. The goal is not always to arrest someone. Sometimes the goal is simply to make people afraid to speak, afraid to organize, afraid to protest, afraid to express political opinions, afraid to even simply post online. And unfortunately, many Sikhs in the diaspora understand this fear very well. To understand the present, we must acknowledge history. The Sikh community carries deep historical trauma from the events of 1984, Operation Blue Star, and the genocide that followed the assassination of Indira Gandhi, and the decades of disappearances, extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detentions, and state repression in Punjab. Many Sikh families who immigrated to Canada, the United Kingdom, the United States, and elsewhere did not simply leave India for economic opportunity. They left because they believed they would have greater safety, freedom, dignity, and a better life abroad. They believed that democratic countries, they could openly discuss Sikh identity, human rights, self-determination, and historical injustices without fear. But increasingly, many members of the Sikh diaspora feel that those pressures have followed them overseas. We have witnessed active reports of activists being monitored, community organizations photographed at protests, social media accounts targeted, online harassment campaigns coordinated against journalists, academics, advocates, and community leaders. Families in India allegedly questioned because relatives abroad participated in protests or advocacy campaigns. Students warned to stay quiet, business owners pressured, and individuals labeled as extremists for simply engaging in political discourse that should be protected in democratic societies. This creates an atmosphere where ordinary people begin to self-censor. And that is one of the most dangerous effects of transnational repression. Because when people become afraid to speak freely in countries like Canada, a country built on democratic freedoms, then foreign intimidation has already achieved part of its objective. One of the clearest examples bringing international attention to this issue was the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a Sikh activist, a father, a president of a Gurdwara in British Columbia in 2023. Regardless of political views, the allegations made by the government of Canada were unprecedented. A democratic government publicly stated that there were credible allegations linking agents of a foreign state to the killing of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, in a 2024 inquiry, and I quote from his testimony, there were ever clear indications that India had violated Canada's sovereignty by targeting Sikh activists on Canadian soil. India's actions were a horrific mistake. That moment changed the conversation globally because it forced many people to confront the reality diaspora communities had been raising concerns about for years. It also raised some difficult questions. How do democracies protect free speech while addressing foreign interference? How do we ensure advocacy is not criminalized? How do we distinguish between legitimate security concerns and politically motivated labeling? How do we ensure diaspora communities can participate in democratic life without fear? These are not easy questions, but ignoring them is not an option. The Hogue report on India, Justice Hogue dedicates significant attention to India's alleged interference, citing the RCMP findings linking Indian government agents to criminal activities, including the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Furthermore, CSIS intelligence report of 2025 states Indian officials, including their Canada-based proxy agents, engage in a range of activities that seek to influence Canadian communities and politicians. These activities attempt to steer Canada's positions into alignment with India's interests on key issues, particularly with respect to how the Indian government perceives Canada-based supporters of an independent homeland that they call Khalistan. It is also important to recognize that transnational repression does not only happen through formal state actors. It often operates through informal networks, online troll campaigns, proxy voices, community pressure, political intimidation, disinformation, anonymous threats, attempts to divide communities internally. People are often told, be careful what you say. Your family back home could face consequences. You may lose opportunities. You may be put on a watch list, or you may not be able to travel. At a press conference in October 2024, the RCMP states, and this is the RCMP commissioner, stated publicly that the RCMP had strong evidence linking violent criminal activity in Canada to the highest levels of the Indian government. This marked one of the most direct accusations by Canadian law enforcement against India regarding transnational repression. Now, most recently, we have seen active news reports that the Lawrence Bishnoi gang has sent an open letter to Canadian police agencies threatening them that they have over 1,000 active members ready and waiting to carry out shootings in Canada. The question arises, how is that an Indian gangster that is in Indian jail has his operatives that are operating on the other side of the world? Whether explicit or implied, these messages create fear. And the fear has a chilling effect on democracy. What makes this issue especially concerning in multicultural countries like Canada is that the diaspora communities should never have to choose between cultural identity and democratic freedom. A Sikh Canadian should not feel unsafe expressing his or her views on Sikh issues. A Hindu Canadian should not feel pressured to conform politically. A Muslim, Christian, Tamil, or Kashmiri, or any other diaspora community member should not fear harassment because of advocacy or identity. This conversation ultimately extends beyond one community. Today, we are discussing Sikh case studies, but transnational repression is a global phenomenon. This is a democratic issue, it's a Canadian issue, and it is an international human rights issue. Canada prides itself on freedom of expression, freedom of religion, peaceful assembly, and democratic participation. Those values must equal must apply equally to all diaspora communities, not selectively, not conditionally, and not only when it is politically convenient. At the same time, conversations like this must remain responsible and principled. We should reject hate, we should reject collective blame, and we should distinguish clearly between governments and ordinary people. Criticism of state actions is not hatred toward a population. Advocating for human rights is not extremism, and democratic debate must never be suppressed through fear or intimidation. Moving forward, these are several things institutions and governments must take seriously. First, governments must strengthen protection against foreign interference in transnational repression. Second, law enforcement and national security agencies must build trust with affected communities. Third, universities and public institutions must ensure students and activists can engage in peaceful political expression without fear. Fourth, social media platforms must take coordinated harassment and disinformation campaigns much more seriously. And finally, communities themselves must continue creating safe spaces for dialogue, education, and solidarity. Silence only empowers intimidation. Open discussion weakens it. I also want to say something important directly to the young people in the audience. Many young Sikhs today are navigating identity, history, and politics in an environment filled with misinformation, polarization, and fear. Do not allow intimidation to silence your curiosity. Learn your history responsibly, engage democratically, and ask questions. Think clearly and never allow others to define your identity for you through fear. The strength of democratic societies is not that everyone agrees. The strength is that people can disagree openly without intimidation or violence. That principle must be protected. In closing, transnational repression is ultimately about power. I'm going to repeat that. Transnational repression is ultimately about power. It is about attempting to extend control beyond borders. But democracies must respond without fear, but with transparency, accountability, rights, and the rule of law. The Sikh diaspora experience offers an important case study because it highlights how global politics can directly affect ordinary families and communities living thousands of kilometers away. And it reminds us that protecting democratic freedom requires constant vigilance, not only from governments, but all of us. Thank you. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Thank you, Harpreet Singh, for taking us through case studies on the issue of transnational repression, which is the primary issue that not only the Sikh community, but many other communities globally that are vying for their freedom are facing today. Moving on to our final speaker for this panel, Basant Singh, who will be speaking to contemporary examples of digital age repression. And the digital age has allowed social media and many other AI-type tools to actually take over in certain spaces where human rights activists, political activists are targeted, their character assassinated, and then they're shown to be much less than they actually are. Their value is decreased, and this often leads to other things, which disinformation campaigns lead to threats, coercion, physical violence that can lead up to and including the assassination of activists globally. So I would ask Basant Singh to take us through contemporary examples of digital age repression. Thank you.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Anti-Sikh violence has never only been about the torture of physical bodies. The deeper goal has always been the annihilation of sovereign Sikh existence itself, the erasure of an alternative way of being. In the digital age, this project of erasure has simply acquired new tools, and critically, it has acquired a timeline. Digital repression against Sikhs did not begin with artificial intelligence or sophisticated surveillance infrastructure. Instead, it began as early as May 2015, 5 years before the pandemic period that governments worldwide would later use to escalate suppression on a mass scale. The intent of the Indian government has always been the same: prevent the Tijaka Lukara from being remembered, documented, and transmitted to the next generation. Digital surveillance is an extension of the state's monopoly on violence. The Battle of Amritsar in June 1984 reminds us that the defining feature of the modern state is its claim to absolute and exclusive sovereignty. It cannot tolerate alternative centers of power. In the digital age, social media monitoring, infiltration of online Sikh communities, pressure on platform companies to deplatform Sikh voices, and the designation of activists as terrorists to justify surveillance all serve the same function. It is the modern state doing what it has always done, ensuring no challenge to its sovereignty goes uncontested. We can name specific cases. In May and June 2015, the Delhi regime blocked neverforget1984.com, the June 1984 movement page, and Sikh24.com within India. These were not fringe platforms. They were translating and publishing materials Sikhs had circulated in print for decades, making it accessible to a global English-speaking audience for the first time. This pattern has only escalated. Recently, the social media accounts of Sikh activists and organizations, one being Sikh Youth of America, has been suspended outright with no appeal process made available. This represents a qualitative shift from the 2015 model of geographic restriction. Then, the Delhi regime blocked content within India. Now, organizations within the diaspora are being suspended and vanish from platforms entirely with no notification and no recourse. Blocking platforms is only one dimension of this repression. What makes the contemporary situation qualitatively different is that the Delhi regime has moved beyond silencing future speech to retroactively erasing the archive itself. Writings, images, and videos related to the Kalukara have been systematically removed from digital search platforms such as Google and Yahoo. The state is not censoring what Sikhs can say today. It is clearing the room that the next generation will walk into when their curiosity about their own history begins. This is the digital equivalent of what the Indian Army did when it destroyed the Sikh reference library during the Battle of Amritsar. The target, then and now, is memory itself. A September 2023 analytical brief by the Canadian Security Intelligence Services concluded that India has developed the capacity to engage in what intelligence agencies specifically call cognitive warfare, which is the use of cyber tools designed to manipulate decision-making processes and public opinion at the neurological and psychological level. CSIS assessed that the government of India would seek to promote a pro-India and anti-Khalistani narrative in Canada using cognitive warfare techniques. This is not disinformation in the ordinary sense. It is a weaponization of digital infrastructure to reshape how targeted communities, including Sikhs, perceive themselves, their safety, and their political possibilities. The goal is not just to silence Sikh voices externally, but to produce internal doubt, self-censorship, and withdrawal from public life. By Jaswant Khalara's work of documenting mass graves and bringing the crimes committed by the Indian forces to the international stage was reframed by the Indian state as a security threat. Today, the same logic is deployed digitally to Sikh advocacy content, which is flagged, demonetized, or removed under counterterrorism frameworks. The Hindutva state's lobbying of social media platforms to remove Sikh independence content is an extension of what Bhai Khalara warned against, the state using the language of law and order to erase Sikh existence from the public sphere. It is best to practice caution against seeking protection purely through Western human rights discourse or through the legal frameworks of states that are themselves complicit. The answer lies in building autonomous grassroots power, digital sovereignty on our own terms. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Thank you, Basant Singh. Digital repression is something that I think everyone on the Sikh spaces right now is actually facing. It is something that as in any activist in the global spheres are facing right now as well. So I think there's something that as in is very much critical in all of our kind of worldview to understand like how much repression is out there, and it's not just physical. On the digital side, it has real impacts, real effects on Sikh activists and also human rights activists globally. I'd like to invite our final member of our panels. This is the final panel before we close. Manveer Kaur, Anita Kaur, and Prabhjot Singh to take their places at the panel at the front. And if we could have this panel take their seats. We are going to move into, right now, the final panel, which will be on international law, state responsibility, and human rights mechanisms. And we're going to have legal obligations, accountability pathways, and global responses covered within that space. So if we could have your attention for just a little bit longer as we close out this final panel, have one final moment at the end where Baku Initiative Group and Sikh Federation International will make an announcement, and then we'll be done for the day. This space right now, where we're going into the global mechanisms around international law and how they can be utilized, this is a space where Sikhs have been working at the international agency level for over 40 years. We are in no doubt as to what the mechanisms in international agencies are, like the United Nations, and we understand there are probably more obstacles in those international agencies than there are actual mechanisms. That some of those places are made for people to continue to struggle without actually providing much output in their struggle for freedom. So while we do not expect that working at the United Nations, the European Union, or international agencies will have the outcome of outright sovereignty, we do understand that they are a battlefield in the larger war for freedom against the Indian state, where we can unveil India for not that it's the actual world's largest democracy, but we remove the veil and show the true nature of a state that is genocidal, oppressive, and arbitrarily detains and executes its own people in its quest for power. So our first speaker on this our last panel is Manveer Kaur. She will be speaking to the international legal obligations and genocide prevention. Manveer Kaur.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Before I will be speaking about the legal obligations and genocide prevention and transnational repression through the lens of June 1984 and its continuing implications, we must understand the purpose of international law itself. International law was not created during times of peace. It emerged in a response to some of the worst atrocities in human history. And from the recognition that states can and sometimes do become perpetrators of violence against their own populations. Every treaty, every convention, every legally binding obligation we will discuss today, it exists because history has taught us a painful lesson, which is that sometimes states do fail to protect their citizens. And sometimes states do become the source of violence itself. So to understand the legal significance of 1984, we must first understand why these legal frameworks were created in the first place. So we have heard Raphael Lemkin's name today several times. I will keep it short here. But basically what he formulated was the term of genocide. And what he argued is that genocide extends beyond the destruction of people in physical form. It also includes the destruction of culture, the destruction of religious institutions, and the destruction of collective identity. And ultimately, his work led to the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And at the heart of this convention is a principle that fundamentally changed international law, which is that state sovereignty cannot be and must not be used as a shield for mass atrocities. That principle matters because the Genocide Convention does not simply punish genocide after it occurs. The obligation begins before it happens. And that brings us to the convention itself. The Genocide Convention has established several obligations. So behind me, we will see some of the articles. I want to focus on the first 3 articles. So the first article requires states to not only punish genocide, but also to prevent it. Prevention is central to international law. International law is not supposed to wait until communities have suffered mass violence. The obligation starts when warning signs appear. The second article defines genocide and introduces what lawyers call dualist specialist, or specific intent. And in this case, the intent is to destroy, in whole or part, a protected group. And this is one of the hardest and highest legal thresholds in international law. Article 3 extends that responsibility beyond direct perpetrators, and it includes conspiracy, incitement, attempt, complicity. So in other words, international law recognizes that atrocities rarely happen because of one individual acting alone. They emerge through systems, through institutions, through structures, and that brings us to a very important point, which is that genocide is not a single event, it is a process. And we have heard the process, the years leading up to it today as well. The United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention identifies several warning signs that frequently appear before mass violence occurs. The first is dehumanization. The second is criminalization of identity and political expression. We will analyze these as well using 1984, but I wanted to give kind of like the frameworks at first so they're a little bit more familiar when I bring them up later. And the fourth is the portraying of a community as an internal threat, as to what some scholars sometimes call the enemy within. But we can also use political science to look at this particular phenomena, and it is called political othering. So in political othering, what occurs is that communities or states create a boundary between each other. So it's almost like us versus them, or them versus us. And once that happens, once these frameworks have been executed, a community is framed as a threat, and extraordinary measures become easier to justify. Legal protections weaken, and violence becomes easier to normalize. This is why prevention is so central to international law. The goal is to recognize the warning signs before they begin. And now we will analyze 1984. So, what happens when we apply these legal principles to June 1984? In the years leading up to Operation Blue Star, Sikh political identity was increasingly framed by the Indian state through the language of extremism, separatism, and national threat. So the legal question that arises here is that, did the Indian state fulfill its obligation under international law to protect civilians, restrain state violence, and prevent mass targeting? My position is that they did not. When we examine the warning indicators identified by modern atrocity prevention frameworks, we see many striking facts, and that was what we looked at here. We see the criminalization of Sikh political identity. We see the use of the security rhetoric. We see the portrayal of the Sikhs as a threat to state stability. And ultimately, we see the deployment of military forces against the Harmandir Sahib complex during one of the most significant periods in the Sikh calendar. The targeting of the Akal Takht was not only a target or an attack on a building itself, it was an attack on Sikh political sovereignty. The destruction of the Sikh reference library was not only an attack on the library itself, it was an attack on Sikh knowledge. And the operations affecting Sikh religious institutions, and it's important to mention, we have heard numbers. The numbers, it's not only Harmandir Sahib complex that was attacked during that time, there were multiple other gurdwaras that were attacked during the same frame. Some sources say around 65, others say it is higher. The official numbers are, we do not know. The official reports are not out there. So the question is not whether these events occurred, they did occur. The question is, how should international law understand them? And that brings us to two possible frameworks. So the first framework is genocide. Under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, genocide requires specific intent, duelist specialists, to destroy a protected group. That requirement, once again, is the highest threshold in international law and also one of the most debated points. The targeting of Sikh religious institutions, the destruction of cultural and historical records, the broader treatment of the Sikh community are all factors that many scholars and advocates argue must be examined when we consider this question. The second framework is crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity include murder, prosecution, enforced disappearance, and other serious violations as a part of widespread or systematic attack against civilian groups. Unlike genocide, crimes against humanity do not require proof of genocidal intent. That distinction matters because whether there's a disagreement regarding if it is genocide or if there is still not, there is still substantial grounds to consider the events that occurred under international law through the frameworks of crimes against humanity. And my purpose today is not to deliver a judgment here or a judicial verdict. My purpose here is to emphasize that both frameworks are raising legal questions that remain unresolved 40 years later, more than 40 years later. And yet accountability remains one of the most unresolved issues. Multiple commission reports were established. I know on the slides it says 2, but in theory, the establishment of the commission reports are over 10. And an interesting factual point is that there's not much out there about the June events. Most of them were conducted during the November Kalukara. So we have reports that are written, we have findings that were published, and we have eyewitness accounts, and yet justice never arrived. The issue is no longer a lack of historical record. The issue is here of a lack of meaningful accountability. International law does not simply require only documentations. It requires actions. It requires us to address it. And yet, when we look at 1984, there is no state action, none of them. When serious violations are not adequately investigated, confidence in the rule of law begins to erode. When accountability is absent, impunity takes place, and impunity takes consequences. It signals that certain communities can experience extraordinary harm without even an ounce of accountability. So at this point, this is not only a political concern, it is also a legal concern. And that helps to explain why the discussions surrounding 1984 continue today. Because for many Sikhs, the story did not end in 1984. It switched, it changed forms. When we speak about 1984, sometimes people think of it as a historical event. But in reality, it was only 42 years ago. And for the Sikh community, we see this as a turning point where patterns of continuing transnational oppression start to occur. And transnational repression is basically the efforts of states to monitor, intimidate, silence, or criminalize activists, in our case, beyond their borders. For the Sikh community, concerns have been raised regarding surveillance, visa restrictions, pressure placed on family members, interference in the community, and the assassination by Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada, Parmjeet Singh Panjwar in Pakistan, and Avtar Singh Khanda in the UK. So this is not merely political anymore. This is engaging international law directly. Under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, individuals are protected from arbitrary detention, entitled to due process, and guaranteed freedom of religion and expression. So the question is no longer whether these protections exist. The question is whether states are willing to enforce them consistently. And that brings us to the obligations of host states such as Canada, United Kingdom, USA. What obligations do states such as Canada, United Kingdom, and the UK carry when individuals within their borders are allegedly targeted by foreign governments? International law provides a clear answer. Under Article 2 of the ICCPR, states are obligated to ensure that the rights protected under the covenant to all individuals within the territory and jurisdiction. That obligation does not disappear because the threat originated abroad. It becomes more important that states have a responsibility to protect freedom of religion, that they have a responsibility to protect freedom of expression. They have a responsibility to protect individuals from intimidation, coercion, and violence. And once again, like if we look at the recent activities, we have seen that states have failed to meet this obligation. So the question here is no longer whether transnational repression exists. The question is whether democratic states are willing to confront it. Because international law means very little if it cannot protect people where they actually live. And one case that demonstrates this clearly is the case of Jagtar Singh Johal. And Johal is a British citizen that has been detained since 2017. Years later, he remains unconvicted. And he's detained in India. His case has generated concerns from the United Nations Special Rapporteurs and numerous human rights organizations. The concerns raised include allegations of torture, concerns regarding prolonged detention, concerns regarding due processes, and the concerns regarding the use of counter-terrorism legislations against a Sikh activist. Whether one's approach to the case is from a human rights perspective or a legal perspective, the central question remains the same, which is that do international legal protections apply equally to everyone, or do they become weaker when national security narratives enter the conversation? Many Sikh advocates argue that Johal's case is not an isolated incident. They view it as a part of a broader pattern within the Sikh political expression that continues to be scrutinized and criminalized. Whether one agrees with that conclusion or not, the case demonstrates why discussions surrounding 1984 remain legally relevant today, because the struggle for accountability did not end in 1984. It continues, and that brings us to the mechanisms that exist to pursue justice. So at this point, a genuine question does emerge. If accountability has not been achieved, what mechanism exists there? The first is the universal jurisdiction. Several countries, including Canada, UK, Germany, possess legislation allowing the prosecution of genocide, crimes against humanity, and torture committed outside their borders. The second is the engagement with the United Nations Special Procedures. Special Rapporteurs on torture, freedom of religion, extrajudicial killing, human rights defenders have all played an important role in documenting violence and creating international pressure. The third is the documentation itself, because documentation is not simply record keeping. Documentation creates the evidence, the foundation on which future accountability depends. The legal mechanisms exist, the historical record exists, the evidence continues to grow. The challenge is not absence of law. The challenge is political will. International law cannot enforce itself. People and institutions must choose to do it. And that brings me to my final point. I want to conclude with this. The question before us is not whether international law exists. The question is whether it will be applied consistently, especially when the perpetrator is a powerful state. Because international law was never intended to protect only the powerful. It was created to protect the vulnerable from abuse of power. The Genocide Convention was not written for easy cases. Human rights law was not created for convenient cases. These frameworks were created precisely for moments when states are violating the rights of the very population they are obligated to protect. 42 years later, June 1984, many legal questions remain unresolved. And many continue to ask whether promises contained within international law apply equally to everyone. Genocide prevention is not a historical obligation, it's a continuing one. Accountability is not an act of revenge, it is a requirement of justice. And the effectiveness of international law is not measured by how many treaty states can sign, it is measured by whether vulnerable people are protected before violence becomes irreversible. Because a legal system that only recognizes communities after they have cremated their dead cannot credibly claim to be preventative. Thank you. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
I'd like to thank Manveer Kaur for that very detailed and extensive explanation of genocide, along with the mechanisms that she outlined. Our next speaker is going to be Anita Lal from the Poetic Justice Foundation. The Poetic Justice Foundation is a Dalit-led organization focused on caste abolition, but also is focused on collective liberation and solidarity building globally. They have an interesting quote, if you ever go to their website, Poetic Justice Foundation, that actually says, "None of us is free if one of us is chained." It's a very powerful statement of solidarity that, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, or where we are in the world, that if any one of us is still suffering, if any one of us is enduring slavery or occupation or genocide, that all of us have an obligation to raise our voices at a minimum, if not stand in solidarity and in action with those communities and those individuals. As we're speaking to the Sikh genocide here today, this is an opportunity for solidarity as well with the Azerbaijani community, and also beyond for those that will be watching this program. So Anita's content and focus will be on policy gaps and opportunities for global advocacy and solidarity. So this is a real opportunity to talk about solidarity, and I think she will take us through many examples and opportunities that we have seen in the past and possibly some that we will see in the future. Over to you, Anita.
Thanks, Maninder, and thanks to the Baku Initiative Group for inviting us here today. I want to start by saying something really simple that's been said a few times today. What happened in Amritsar in 1984 was not a historical event that ended. It was the continuation of a method that says when people resist, when they organize, when they name what is being done to them, the state will silence them, regardless of what state borders they need to cross. The operation at Harminder Sahib was not only a military assault, but it was also a message. The message was sent to every Sikh, every Dalit, every Kashmiri, every Muslim, every tribal community, every queer person, every journalist, every organizer inside and outside of India. The message was clear. There is nowhere you can go. There is nowhere you can go that we cannot reach you. There is no identity you can claim that we will not criminalize, and there is no movement you can build that we will not destroy. So today, as we sit here in Baku, because that message is still being sent every single day to all of us. And the most tragic part, the policy failure, is that the international community keeps receiving this message and is unable to name it for what it is. So a little bit about myself. I'm a Sikh. I'm born and raised in Canada, and I come from a Dalit family. Dalits were formerly called the Untouchables under the centuries-old oppressive structure of caste. So there are 4 castes under this Brahmanical system, and the Dalits and the Adivasis, which are the indigenous people of the lands, fall outside that system and are considered impure. So they make up approximately 25% of the entire population of India, which is over 300 million people. And what I want to speak to is the gap between what the architecture promises, so a bit of what my colleagues have talked about and will talk about, and what it actually delivers. What it looks like to build solidarity across movements when the law repeatedly refuses to protect us. And like most of the delegation here today, this isn't just a theory, but this is our lived experiences. And I'm going to share an example of my own, actually. So in 2020, we all witnessed the largest nonviolent movement in human history, the farmers' protest. And in January of 2021, the international community planned a global day of solidarity for January 26th, which is the Indian Republic Day, to support the farmers. Poetic Justice Foundation, which is the organization I'm a co-founder of, we created a communications toolkit for the organizers to use, which included key messages, media outreach techniques, posters, and billboards. Our goal was to help deliver a strong global message of solidarity. But what we really weren't expecting what happened next. So for the next 6 weeks, there were headlines in the Modi-controlled media calling us terrorists, anti-nationals, and foreign-funded destabilizers of India. Death threats and abuse on all social media platforms. They even went as far as attacking people associated with us personally and professionally. The Delhi police held press conferences about the toolkit case, putting out a FIR against us and arresting activists in India that attended our marketing meetings. In Punjab, the police went door to door in villages, searching for our family members our co-founders and board members. Our home addresses and photos were leaked and circulated across Indian news channels, news media, and social media platforms. The Indian Prime Minister Modi, leader of a country of over 1 billion people, personally mentioned Poetic Justice Foundation by naming us while he was speaking at a tea plantation in Assam. He actually named us. And what did Canada do? Nothing. And none of this is surprising to most of the people in this room. Not once have we seen the state, whether it's national or international, step in and put a name to the decades of oppression that India has been carrying out on minorities and dissenting communities. The lack of action and accountability goes beyond India. We are witness to a number of genocides happening, and those leading them have been called war criminals, and arrest warrants have been issued by the International Criminal Court. Yet all these mechanisms keep falling short. That's how they've been designed, to protect the state and not the people. And there are many communities that are living inside the same system of Brahmanical state repression as the Sikhs and Dalits. And in solidarity, I'm going to take a few minutes and name a few of these movements and show the similarities in how India responds to us all. First, the people of Kashmir, who are living under military occupation. In August of 2019, India revoked Article 370 and 35A without any consultation and stripped India of its constitutionally protected autonomy, a move that the United Nations Human Rights Council condemned. And since then, over 6 million non-Kashmiri people have been given residency under new laws that have been documented as settler colonization in real time. So just think about that for a second. 6 million settlers. That's 1 for every 2 indigenous Kashmiris on that land. Photojournalist Masrat Sara fled to the United States after being charged under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is a draconian counter-terror law routinely used to imprison journalists and activists without a trial. She continued her work from the US, and in India retaliated by beating her father and brother back home, making her family pay for her dissent. So the repression of Kashmiris does not respect borders. It follows activists into the diasporic communities, it reaches back to their families, and it operates through the same coordinated networks of disinformation and legal harassment that are used against Sikhs and Dalit communities. We also have the Muslim community in India that's been living through what legal scholars are calling a manufactured statelessness project. So the Citizenship Amendment Act, also known as the CAA, created a religious test for Indian citizenship, but it explicitly excluded Muslims from pathways available to their own community, pathways available to every other community. This is accompanied by state-sponsored and state-tolerated mob violence. In 2023, the U.S. State Department documented credible reports of Indian security forces participating in killings of Muslims and Dalits. Muslims' homes have been bulldozed by state machinery as collective punishment, and Muslim history is being erased from school textbooks. In the diaspora, the Indian American Muslim Council has documented how transnational repression against Muslim critics in North America follows the same playbook: retaliation against family members in India, surveillance, disinformation campaigns, and critics are designated as threats. We also have the Kuki-Zo and other tribal people of Manipur. Since 2023, they've been experiencing what independent human rights organizations have called ethnic cleansing. So since then, nearly 250 people have been killed, tens of thousands have been displaced, 317 churches have been destroyed, over 6,000 homes burned, dozens of women raped, and over 50,000 people remain in displacement camps with limited access to healthcare, sanitation, and food. And even after over 2 years, the Indian state has yet to hold a single perpetrator accountable. Women and feminist activists who have documented the violence, who published fact-finding reports, were charged with sedition, with waging war against India and foretelling the truth about what they have witnessed. So this is a Brahmanical state in action, not only in Punjab, not only in Kashmir, but in the northeast, in the hills, in every community that does not fit the Hindu supremacist vision of what India is supposed to be. We also have the queer community in India, and particularly queer Dalits, queer Muslims, and queer tribal people who live at the intersection of multiple marginalizations. And they've experienced how Hindutva weaponizes their existence. The BJP government has consistently opposed marriage equality and opposed transgender rights protection. Queer Dalit and queer Muslim activists have also faced the same campaigns of harassment, doxing, and disinformation. And so now I quickly want to talk about the policy gaps. First, there are no mechanisms that exist to name this pattern as what it is. So when India's Ministry of External Affairs issued a classified memo in April 2023, signed by the Indian Foreign Secretary, titled Action Points on Khalistan Extremism, ordering consulates in North America to launch a sophisticated crackdown scheme against Sikh diaspora organizations and individuals, and ordering concrete measures to hold the suspects accountable. And then 2 months later, we had Bhai Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who was murdered outside a Gurdwara in Surrey, BC. The response from the international community was diplomatic. It was carefully managed, proportionate to geopolitical interests, and not proportionate to human lives. So meanwhile, the Indian American Muslim Council has presented testimony to the US Congress documenting transnational repression of Muslim critics in North America. Kashmiri journalists, like Mazrat Zara, are having their families beaten in retaliation for their work abroad. The same pattern, the same playbook, multiple communities, zero accountability. And the policy gap is this: transnational repression by India against its diaspora is well documented, multi-community, and consistent. And the international legal framework has no category for it that generates consequences. The media is also part of the gap. When the American media covered California's anti-caste bill, SB 403, they quoted representatives from the Hindu American Foundation and KONA, both right-wing Hindu nationalist groups, as concerned South Asians. They didn't disclose that both of these organizations are deeply rooted and associated with right-wing Hindu nationalists, and at one point were considered militant by the CIA. They called it a community disagreement. So when legislators see community disagreement, they don't see it as the coordinated, foreign-linked suppression campaign that it actually is. And this is all strategic. Hindutva groups have specifically and systematically worked to make accurate coverage of their networks impossible. They monopolize access to government officials, they pursue textbook revisions, they file lawsuits against journalists and professors, and they launch social media wars. And the media, lacking the institutional literacy to name the pattern, reports it as a balanced dispute. So legislators can't protect what they can't see, human rights bodies can't intervene where nothing is named, and this is not incidental. The media group holds the whole structure of impunity in place. And third is homophobia and how it's being weaponized into law. So the term homophobia, which many Hindus and Hindu organizations, didn't I say Hinduphobia? Hinduphobia, sorry. Which many Hindus and Hindu organizations have explicitly rejected as being equivalent to Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, is now being actively pursued as a legislative category in Canada. So let's talk about what this means. It means that the same network that coordinated 1.3 million emails against universities in harassment, that sent death threats to Dalit scholars, that doxed Sikh activists and families, that intervened in campaigns to get cast as a protected category, that very network is now seeking legal protection from criticism. So this is silencing operating through the law. Once it succeeds, every Dalit activist who names caste, every Sikh organizer who names the Indian state, every Kashmiri journalist who documents occupation, every Muslim community members who resist the CIA, all of them become vulnerable to legal action under a framework that calls their resistance Hinduphobia. This is what organized transnational repression looks like when it matures. It stops being extrajudicial, it becomes procedural. It puts on a suit and it goes to court. So now I'm going to quickly talk about solidarity. And I'm going to focus on the Combahee River Collective, which is a Black feminist organization whose 1977 statement remains one of the most important political documents in the history of liberation movements. They wrote, "We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression." And this is a part that I want everyone to actually really pay attention to. If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. So the collective understood that the freedom of those at the very bottom of every hierarchy is not a side project of liberation. It is a condition of liberation. You can't dismantle only one system of domination and leave the other standing, because they hold each other up. So they also said, we struggle together with Black men against racism, while we also struggle with Black men about sexism. So to put this in context for all those that sit in this room, as a Dalit anti-caste activist, I struggle with all of you against the repression, while I also struggle within that same space against casteism. So that tension, holding together a common struggle and our internal accountability, is the work. It's not comfortable, but it's necessary. And for us, as South Asian communities, as diaspora communities, as communities shaped by Brahmanical hierarchy, even as we resist it, that means we can't fight for Sikh freedom while looking away from anti-Dalit violence within our own communities. We can't fight for Dalit rights while ignoring what's being done to Kashmiris. We can't fight for Kashmir while being silent about Kukuzo people of Manipur. That knowledge is the foundation of real solidarity. That collective also wrote, every Black woman who came out of a strongly felt need for some level of possibility that did not previously exist in her life. So that is why we're collectively here. Not because the work is safe, because of possibility it creates for our communities, for those coming after us, for the people that are still inside those villages in Punjab, those in the hills in Manipur, and those detention camps in Assam. That possibility does not exist anywhere else. It exists because we make it exist. We make it real. And so is our solidarity, so is our love for our people, and so is our refusal. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
I'd like to thank Anita for the enlightening comments around global solidarity and all the shapes and forms that it takes. As we move to our final speaker and the final panel, I wanted to kind of just touch on a few things before Prabhjot Singh walks us through a global Sikh response from a sovereignty lens for the Sikh people, which will be the final and the concluding kind of remarks for today's final panel. We need to look at what India does in general when it comes to politics. The commentary that their politicians make set the tone for everything that happens at the societal level. You had Prime Minister Modi just a few years ago state that this is the new India, this is the India that comes into your homes and kills you, basically for those that do not agree with the one nation, one religion, one flag ideology of the Hindutva regime that he leads today. You have another Chief Minister of Assam, Himanta Biswa Sarma, and I quote, "We need 400 seats to build these temples. It's not our job to make mullahs," which is a term used for Muslim clerics, and it's sometimes used very derogatorily. And he's stating that I shut down 700 madrasas in one day. Vote for us to stop this infiltration of this scum. End quote. This is how Indian leadership views its minorities, that if you disagree with them, they'll come into your homes and kill you. And if you want to win in an election, you use and you vilify a specific minority at a specific time, be it Dalits, be it Muslims, be it Christians, be it Sikhs, but you vilify an entire community in order to garner the votes of the majority. And that is exactly what's happening across various states and communities across the Indian subcontinent. That is what puts people at risk every day in a country like India, because they will never be considered equal. They will always be second class at best. So as Prabhjot Singh talks about the idea of a global Sikh response from the lens of Sikh sovereignty, it's important to understand that it is only sovereignty that will resolve these issues for the Sikh community. There is no judicial justice for us in India. 42 years later, after the events of June of 1984 and November 1984, if there is no justice till this point, justice delayed is justice denied, as it said. And for us, the only justice now is in the form of Khalistan and sovereignty. So I'll hand it over to Prabhjot Singh.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. So throughout today's conference, one common thread we've seen and heard by every speaker today is acknowledging this idea that 1984 was not just a singular event, and it's not a closed chapter of our history. It continues to be the defining moment and the defining symbol or icon of modern Sikh history. It reminds us of who we are, why tyrants have repeatedly targeted us, what our elders endured, and what level of resolve is required from us in the present. But despite this resilience, the cost of those lessons we carry with us that shape our identity is that 1984 saw the most horrific violence witnessed in the subcontinent since partition in 1947. And while the survivors and the community continue to deal with the impacts of genocide and the ongoing acts of violence that are a continuity of genocide, the individuals responsible for orchestrating and perpetrating these campaigns have never been held accountable for their role in planning, enabling, and shielding these campaigns of violence. So they completely remain free and continue to remain shielded by impunity. That impunity tells state officials, police agencies, and political actors that violence against a targeted community, against India's ethnic minorities, can be managed and absorbed into the regular, ordinary, day-to-day life of the Indian state. The tools we've seen that India has used are very clear and have been repeatedly used against every single community. There's the dehumanization, there's intimidation, there's overwhelming violence, denial, impunity, and ultimately the goal is assimilation. And the thing that we need to recognize today, and when we look at the title of today's conference, Transnational Repression as an Extension of Genocide, is acknowledgement that these tools haven't disappeared. They've evolved into a new form for the same purposes and deployed in a different way, in a different space, but fundamentally for the same purpose using the same mechanisms. So what Sikhs are witnessing and experiencing today in Canada, in the United Kingdom, the United States, and elsewhere is not disconnected from 1984. It's the same strategy that's extending beyond India's border through transnational repression. And this is where the role of the international community matters and where this idea of a global response is significant. Because a lot of the times when we talk about human rights issues, when we talk about global challenges with other governments and other partners, it's often looked at as a foreign policy issue somewhere else far away that isn't relevant. But when we look at this case specifically, that's absolutely not the case. When we look at what's transpired and what the Sikh community has experienced over the past several years, it's clear that the lack of recognition by the international community and the lack of accountability for India's crimes in 1984 is intricately tied to why Indian officials felt so emboldened as to orchestrate assassinations in Canada 40 years later, and why their prime minister feels so emboldened to openly brag that his new India engages in extrajudicial killings. As Maninder Singh mentioned, in 2024, India's prime minister spoke in multiple election rallies saying that this new India under Modi would enter the homes of its enemies and kill them. So this is an explicit statement coming from from the highest government official in the country that's officially sanctioning extrajudicial violence as state policy. Almost 9 years ago, Indian security officials abducted Jagtar Singh Johal from the streets of Punjab, tortured him and has held him in custody until today, despite 0 convictions over that entire period of time. In fact, he was actually acquitted of some of his charges that have been copy-pasted across 9 different charge sheets. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention concluded that he's been arbitrarily detained and targeted because of his religious faith, his identity, and his political opinion and belief and support in an independent Khalistan. Jagtar Singh is a British national, but again, there's been no accountability for India's gross human rights violations. And this goes to things that Anita was talking about earlier, is that the calibration and the response of many countries in the international community is tied to their geopolitical interest and their trade ties. So given this context and India's belligerent actions and attacks against the community, the international community can't afford to approach India's violence with any kind of hesitation or ambiguity any further. A failure to respond meaningfully to violations of international law and the crime of genocide signals that states like India can target their minorities without any kind of consequence. And as we sit here today, 42 years after the events of 1984, we're standing here looking over the edge of a cliff. India stands at a precipice where experts around the world are raising concern about the increasing potential and capacity for India to carry out another genocide. The consolidation of power, the erosion of democratic institutions, attacks on religious minorities, and the normalization of collective punishments for entire communities has created the conditions in which mass atrocities become increasingly foreseeable. In 2023, a former special rapporteur on minority issues in the UN Human Rights Council appeared before a committee and warned that, quote, India risks becoming one of the world's main generators of instability, atrocities, and violence because of the massive scale and gravity of the violations and abuses targeting mainly religious and other minorities, end quote. And the important thing for us to recognize and understand here is that this instability is not internal alone. It's not limited to India's borders. India has increasingly acted as a destabilizing regional power externally and internationally as well. So in April 2025, India unilaterally suspended the Indus Water Treaty with Pakistan. So this was a clear, intentional state policy and a decision that was made to make efforts to shut off water access for millions of people in Pakistan who rely and depend on that water for their daily needs and for sustainability of their food production, industry, and every other use of water, which is the basis of sustaining life. So India didn't consider the humanitarian impacts of diverting that river water that's been flowing for centuries in that region. Literally 1 month later, India goes on to launch strikes, unilateral acts of aggression against Pakistan in what becomes one of the most serious military crises between 2 nuclear-armed states in decades. And literally, without wasting any time, 2 months later, India conducted drone strikes on its eastern borders, this time leading excursions into the territory of Myanmar. So in a similar vein, a UN Human Rights Council communication in January of last year also raised concerns that India's systematic attacks on Sikh activists and freedom of expression are contributing to an increasingly hostile environment in Punjab. So this is a clear global recognition from the world's most senior human rights officials of the intensification of conflict in Punjab if India continues to engage in its violent repression of Sikh activists. And as we've seen in conflicts ongoing around the world, there's reverberations and impacts of India's actions that'll be much further than its own borders. So the international community can't separate India's domestic repression of its religious and ethnic minorities from its external conduct. A state that treats minorities, dissidents, and stateless peoples as internal enemies will eventually export that logic beyond its borders, and in India's case, it's already been escalating that in the past several years. So our delegation from Sikh Federation International had the opportunity to meet with representatives of the government of Azerbaijan to raise these concerns yesterday and had a very constructive discussion on this very issue. And as a stateless people mobilizing to restore our sovereignty through the establishment of an independent Khalistan, we look forward to and are committed to continuing efforts to build solidarity and partnerships around the world to ensure the collective liberation of all peoples around the world and to decolonize the world order as it exists. And we're equally committed and looking forward to strengthening our people-to-people ties with the people of Azerbaijan. So this dialogue and commemoration that we've done today is not just about remembering an event in the past, but proactively shaping the future of the region in a vision that's rooted in dignity, justice, self-determination, and the vision of Sarbata Dapala, that's the welfare of all, that's a root of the Sikh vision of politics and governance. So I want to end when we're talking about the Sikh response by noting that despite the violence and threats that our community is facing, our community continues to remain resolute and steadfast, completely unflinching. We've faced persecution, massacres, genocide throughout our entire history simply for existing and being who we are. And India's targeting of our people today is simply the latest iteration of that. So our community will continue commemorating the martyrs of June 1984 and engaging in its right to advocate for human rights and the establishment of an independent Khalistan, no matter what the cost. And the sacrifice of Shaheed Bhai Hardeep Singh Nijjar in June 2023 is a testament to that fact. Thank you.
Thank you to Prabhjot Singh for those concluding remarks around the sovereignty lens of the Sikh people. I'll make the closing remarks here for our conference and our panel discussions today. And then we have one small announcement at the end we'll start with. But I wanted to speak about that June 1984 is not just simply an assault on bricks and mortar and on buildings being destroyed, but it was on the very soul of the Sikh nation. And yet history teaches us that Sikhs rise from the ashes undefeated, as our victory is often and always ethical and moral in these situations. In the Sketch of the Sikhs in 1812, a book written by a British author, it was observed, and I quote, "No power has ever been able to subdue them permanently. Their spirit of independence is unconquerable," end quote. These voices from history remind us as Sikhs that Sikhs are a people who find victory even in death, who cannot be erased by an empire or a state. Operation Blue Star, as the name India has given it, and the Sikh genocide, or the Tija Kalugara, the Sikhs will remember it, and its aftermath were not isolated events, they were part of a systematic campaign. Amnesty International reported in 1994 that thousands of Sikh men were detained without trial, tortured, and many never reappeared. These atrocities were not accidents. They were deliberate acts of repression designed to extinguish Sikh sovereignty. Today, this repression has crossed borders. Sikh activists abroad face surveillance, intimidation, and even assassination. This is transnational repression, the extension of genocide into the diaspora. It is meant to silence Sikhs everywhere, but it has only strengthened our resolve. Sovereignty is not a political option for Sikhs, it is our spiritual and temporal essence. Guru Har Gobind, the sixth Guru, taught us Midi Pidi, which is the combination of temporal and spiritual power, where Sikhs must remain political, and at the same time, that politicalness, that activism has to be guided by spirituality. Guru Gobind Singh, the 10th Guru, formulated the Khalsa as a sovereign and collective to ensure that not only their rights were protected, but in the form of Sarvata Pala, the welfare of all, that all people everywhere would be protected by Sikhs. Sovereignty means self-determination rooted in justice, equality, and seva, which is selfless service to all of humanity. Without sovereignty, Sikh identity risks assimilation. With sovereignty, Sikhs will fulfill their mission of justice for all humanity. At this moment, the global Sikh response must be fearless and united. For that, we need partners, we need solidarity, and we need support as well. We need to keep our memory fresh and alive around June 1984 through education, art, and intergenerational storytelling, the preservation of our historical artifacts, and the preservation of our history outside of Punjab in countries like Azerbaijan.
We need advocacy to continue the demand for accountability for torture, disappearances, extrajudicial killings, not because we believe in the Indian judicial system, rather to unveil the true face and nature of the so-called world's largest democracy for the genocide perpetrator that it is. We need solidarity and to stand with repressed peoples, showing Sikh sovereignty as a model of justice. We need innovation to harness technology and diaspora networks to amplify Sikh voices. And we need institutions to build Sikh schools, gurdwaras, think tanks, and humanitarian efforts that embody the Sikh vision of sovereignty. In closing, we need to build a respectable dialogue and solidarity with the people of Azerbaijan in the shared solidarity we have around resilience, in the shared history that we have when it comes to torture, and the shared history that we have of being occupied peoples where our heritage, language, and culture were at risk. And we look to the Azerbaijani people for their resilience in being able to free themselves from the bonds of slavery and occupation in the early 1990s. And we look forward to working with them in the future, where the Sikh people in their quest for Khalistan will do the same. Let us leave here with the conviction that Amritsar was not the end. It was the beginning of a global Sikh response, a response that will lead them to their homeland Khalistan, freedom that will ensure that generations of their people and their culture, heritage, language, and faith will be safeguarded. In the end, we would like to thank the Azerbaijan media, their politicians, Baku State University, but most of all, we would like to thank the Baku Initiative Group and their executive director, Abbas Abbasov, and his entire team for the unwavering support of people's movements and leading the global south to ensure that Baku has now become a center point of hub of activity for many people's movements, those seeking human rights, those seeking justice, and those seeking freedom to be able to come here freely, to use platforms here to ensure that their voices are heard globally. So we thank them deeply from the bottom of our hearts for these platforms, these opportunities, and to ensure this partnership into the future. I'd like to ask Abbas Abbasov to now provide his closing remarks and make the announcement at the close of this conference. Thank you very much. And the term that you've been hearing all day today from the Sikh community, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh, what this translates to is Vaheguru is the term for the creator or God. Khalsa is made in the embodiment as a collective of Sikhs that are baptized. Those Sikhs are the form of God, and Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh means victory will always be to the creator, will be to the truth. So when we say this, every time one Sikh sees another Sikh, we say to each other, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. And in opening and closing of our addresses, we do the same. So as in closing, we hope that victory is always to the truth, and in that pursuit of truth, that we have your support and solidarity as you would always have ours. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Dear participants, distinguished delegates, at the end of this meaningful conference, I would like to extend my gratitude, my sincere thanks to members of the International Sikh Federation for their contribution to protection of Sikhs' rights globally. You are a good example, guys. Your activities are best practices for other civil society organizations which are engaged in protection of indigenous people's rights and ethnic minorities' rights. Thanks a lot for your such constructive presentations, for such substantive opinions, thoughts, shared experience, and for everything. Thank you very much, guys. And the last step before to complete our conference, with great honor, I would like to announce the ceremony of the signing memorandum between Baku Initiative Group and International Sikh Federation, the memorandum which will positively contribute to strengthen our collaboration at the academic level. Thank you very much.
Sakladım.